The silence was wrong. 23 years I've been patrolling these woods, and I'd never heard anything like it, or rather, never not heard anything like it. The forest had gone completely, unnaturally quiet, as if every living thing had simply vanished or was holding its breath in terror. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been the head ranger at Whispering Pines National Forest since I was 25. I've seen hikers lost for days emerge babbling about things that couldn't exist. I've tracked what looked like bare prints that suddenly stopped mid-stride, as if whatever made them had been plucked from the earth. I found campsites abandoned so hastily that coffee was still warm in the cups, tents still zipped tight, with no sign of their occupants anywhere within a 50-mile radius. But this silence, this was different. This was hungry. It started on a Tuesday morning in late October. The leaves had turned their brilliant reds and golds, and the forest should have been alive with the sounds of migrating birds, scurrying squirrels preparing for winter, the distant crack of branches as deer moved through the underbrush. Instead, as I stepped out of my truck at the Pine Ridge trailhead, I was greeted by a silence so complete it made my ears ring. I'd been called out by a group of geology students from the state university. They'd been conducting a survey of mineral deposits in the deeper parts of the forest when their radio contact went dead. Their professor, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, had been expecting regular check-ins every 4 hours. When 8 hours passed without word, she'd driven to the ranger station in a panic. "They're experienced hikers," she told me, wringing her hands. "They know these woods. Something's wrong, Ranger Webb. I can feel it." I'd reassured her, of course. Search and rescue was routine for me. People got turned around, equipment failed, sometimes they just lost track of time when they were focused on their work. But as I stood at the trailhead, breathing in air that felt thick and oppressive despite the crisp autumn temperature, I began to understand her fear. The silence pressed against me like a physical weight. I unholstered my radio and tried to raise the station. "Base, this is Webb. Do you copy?" Static. Not the usual radio interference you'd expect in the forest, just pure white static that seemed to go on forever. I checked my equipment. Everything was working properly. The radio showed full signal strength, but when I tried again, I got the same endless static. It was as if something was drowning out all communication, filling the airwaves with electronic snow. The trail the students had taken wound deep into the forest, following an old logging road that had been abandoned decades ago. It was a challenging hike, but not dangerous if you knew what you were doing. The path was well marked, and there were no significant drop-offs or hazardous areas. Still, as I began following their route, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to lean in closer as I walked, their branches reaching across the path like gnarled fingers. The silence followed me, a bubble of absolute quiet that moved with me through the forest. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. About 2 miles in, I found their first marker. The geology team had been leaving small fluorescent flags tied to branches every 100 yards or so, a smart precaution that would help them retrace their steps. The flag was there, bright orange against the muted colors of the forest, but something about it bothered me. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The flag wasn't moving. There was no wind, which was strange enough, but even the slightest air current should have made the lightweight fabric flutter. Instead, it hung perfectly still, as if the air around it had become solid. I reached out to touch it, and my hand passed through empty space. The flag was there. I could see it clearly, but I couldn't feel it. It was like trying to grasp a hologram. The wrongness of it made my skin crawl, but I pressed on. The students were out there somewhere, and whether this was some kind of atmospheric phenomenon or equipment malfunction, they needed help. The next flag was a 1/4 mile further, and it was the same, visible but intangible. This one seemed to shimmer slightly, as if I was looking at it through water. I tried to photograph it with my phone, but the camera showed only empty forest. The flag was there when I looked directly at it, gone when I tried to capture it. My phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual this deep in the forest, but the screen kept flickering with interference patterns I'd never seen before. Strange geometric shapes would appear for a split second, then disappear, leaving ghostly afterimages burned into my retinas. The path began to slope downward, following the contours of a dry creek bed. This was where the students would have found their best mineral samples. The exposed rock formations here were rich in quartz and feldspar, exactly what they'd been looking for. But as I descended, the silence grew even more oppressive. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was as if sound itself had been removed from this place, leaving behind something that was less than nothing. I found their campsite at the bottom of the slope, and my blood ran cold. The tents were set up in a perfect circle, their entrances all facing inward toward a central fire pit. But there was no fire, and no people. The tents were zipped shut, but when I approached the nearest one and called out, there was no response. The silence swallowed my voice completely. I could feel myself shouting, but I couldn't hear anything, not even the vibration in my own throat. I unzipped the first tent and peered inside. Sleeping bags were laid out neatly, personal belongings arranged as if their owners had just stepped out for a moment. But there was something wrong with the air inside the tent. It shimmered like heat waves, and when I reached inside to grab a backpack, my hand passed through it just like the flags. All 5 tents were the same. Everything was there, but nothing was really there. The students' equipment, their samples, their notebooks, all visible, all impossible to touch. It was as if I was looking at the memory of a campsite rather than the actual thing. In the center of the circle, where the fire pit should have been, there was instead a perfectly round hole in the ground. It was about 3 feet in diameter, and when I shined my flashlight into it, the beam simply disappeared. Not reflected, not absorbed, just gone, as if it had never existed. The silence emanating from the hole was different from the oppressive quiet of the forest. This was active silence, hungry and reaching. I could feel it trying to pull at me, not physically, but in some other way that made my soul want to crawl out of my body and hide. I backed away from the hole, but as I did, I heard something that made me freeze in terror. It was a voice, faint and distorted, coming from the depths of that impossible pit. "Ranger Webb, help us." It was Dr. Morrison's voice, but wrong somehow, stretched and echoing, as if it was coming from very far away. I crept back to the edge of the hole, my hand shaking. "Dr. Morrison, where are you?" The response came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to originate inside my own head. We went down to see, but we can't come back up. The silence won't let us." I looked into the hole again, and this time I saw something that made my rational mind want to shut down entirely. Far below, impossibly far given the size of the hole, there were lights. Not electric lights, but something organic and pulsing, like bioluminescent organisms in the deep ocean. And moving among those lights, I could see shapes that might have been human, but moved wrong, as if they were swimming through thick liquid rather than walking. "Don't come down," the voice whispered. "Don't let it hear you. It's been waiting so long for someone new to listen to." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. As I did, I noticed something else that chilled me to the bone. The hole wasn't just in the ground, it was in everything. The trees around the clearing had perfectly round holes cut through their trunks at exactly the same height as the ground level opening. The holes continued up through the canopy, and when I looked directly overhead, I could see a perfect cylinder of empty space stretching up toward the sky. The silence was coming from above as well as below. That's when I understood. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a tunnel that went both ways, down into the earth and up into, what? Space? Some other dimension. The mathematics of it hurt my brain to contemplate. I tried to use my radio again, but the static had changed. Instead of white noise, I could hear whispers in the interference, voices calling for help, pleading, bargaining. And underneath it all, something else, a vast intelligence that was listening to every word, cataloging every plea, feeding on the desperation. I had to get out of there. I had to get back to the station and report this, even though I knew no one would believe me. But as I turned to leave, I found that the path I'd followed down into the clearing was gone. Not overgrown or blocked, simply gone, as if it had never existed. The forest around me had changed too. The trees were wrong, their bark too smooth, their branches growing in impossible spirals. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy and organic, like walking on flesh. And the silence was no longer just around me. It was in me, filling my lungs, replacing my blood, becoming part of me. I tried to run, but my feet couldn't find purchase on the shifting ground. The harder I tried to escape, the more the forest seemed to twist around me, leading me in circles back to the clearing with its hungry hole and its promises of reunion with the lost students. That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't going to rescue anyone. I was going to join them. The whispers and the radio static were getting louder, more insistent. I could make out individual voices now. Dr. Morrison, her 5 students, and dozens of others. How many people had found this place over the years? How many had been drawn down into that impossible tunnel? It's not so bad, Dr. Morrison's voice said, clearer now. The silence is peaceful once you stop fighting it. Come down, range your web. Come down and listen to what it has to tell you. I looked at the hole again, and this time I could see movement much closer to the surface. Pale shapes climbing upward, reaching for me with arms that were too long and fingers that bent in too many directions. The students, changed by whatever lived in the silence between the trees. My radio crackled one more time, and I heard my own voice coming through the static. Base, this is Webb. I found them. They're all here, and they're safe. But I think I'm going to stay with them for a while. Don't send anyone else. I hadn't said those words. I hadn't even thought them. But as I listened to my own voice lie to the dispatcher, I felt my feet beginning to move toward the hole. The silence wrapped around me like loving arms, promising rest, promising an end to the noise and chaos of the world above. I'm writing this on my phone while I still can, while some part of me is still me. The battery is almost dead, and I can feel the silence seeping into my thoughts, making them slower, quieter, more peaceful. Soon, I won't want to resist anymore. Soon, I'll understand what the students understood, what all the missing people understood. The silence isn't empty. It's full of voices that have been waiting so long to be heard. If you're reading this, if my phone somehow uploads this before the battery dies, don't come looking for us. Don't try to find whispering pines. The silence has been growing stronger, spreading further. It's not just in the forest anymore. It's everywhere. And it's listening. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been working the night shift at Canyon Mesa for 6 years. It's not a job most people want, walking the empty trails in darkness, checking on campsites where the shadows play tricks on your eyes, investigating the strange sounds that drift up from the canyon depths. But I've always been comfortable in the dark. At least, I was until tonight. The trouble started with the Werner family. They'd reserved Campsite 17 for a week-long vacation, parents, 2 teenage kids, and a grandmother who insisted on sleeping in a tent despite her arthritis. Standard family camping trip, nothing unusual. They'd checked in Tuesday afternoon, and I'd done my routine walkthrough that evening. Everything normal. Kids playing cards by the fire, parents setting up their equipment, grandmother telling stories about her own camping adventures. Wednesday night, I'd swung by around 11 p.m. The family was settling in for the night, but the grandmother, Eleanor Werner, had approached me with a concern. Ranger Morrison, she'd said, her voice tight with worry. There's something wrong with the sounds out there. I'd listened carefully, but all I could hear were the usual night noises. Owls, coyotes in the distance, the whisper of wind through the rock formations. What kind of sounds, Mrs. Werner? It's not what I'm hearing, she'd replied, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It's what I'm not hearing. The insects have gone quiet. All of them. At the same time, I'd reassured her that it was probably just the weather. A front moving through could make wildlife behave strangely. But as I'd walked back to my truck, I noticed she was right. The normal symphony of cricket songs and night bugs had fallen silent, leaving only the distant howl of wind through the canyon. Thursday night, I found Campsite 17 empty. Not packed up and abandoned, empty. The tents were still there, zipped shut, with sleeping bags and personal belongings inside. The fire pit still held warm coals. Food was laid out on the picnic table, as if the family had just stepped away for a moment. Their car was still in the parking area, keys hanging from the ignition. I called it in immediately, and by Friday morning we'd had search and rescue teams combing every inch of the park. They'd found nothing. No tracks leading away from the campsite, no signs of struggle, no indication of where 5 people could have gone. It was as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. The search continued through the weekend, bringing in helicopters and K-9 units. The story made the local news, then the national news. The Werner family had become another entry in the long list of people who disappeared without a trace in our national parks. But I knew something the investigators didn't. I'd been back to campsite 17 every night since the disappearance, and each time I'd heard things that made my skin crawl. Whispers in the wind that sounded almost like voices. Footsteps that stopped the moment I turned toward them. And underneath it all, a sound I couldn't quite identify, a wet, sliding noise like something large moving through mud, coming from the direction of the canyon rim. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, I come prepared. I brought my night vision goggles, a high-powered flashlight, and a digital recorder. If there was something out there, some explanation for what had happened to the Werner family, I was going to find it. The Park Service had officially called off the search, but I couldn't let it go. 5 people didn't just disappear. There had to be evidence, some clue that everyone else had missed. Campsite 17 sat on a small plateau about a quarter-mile from the canyon rim. During the day, it offered spectacular views of the red rock formations and the valley below. At night, it was one of the most isolated spots in the park, surrounded by darkness so complete it seemed solid. I parked my truck at the main road and hiked in, wanting to approach quietly in case whatever had taken the Werner family was still in the area. The silence Mrs. Werner had mentioned was even more pronounced now, not just the absence of insects, but of everything. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals in the brush, no distant coyote songs. Even the wind had died to nothing, leaving the air perfectly still. As I crested the small hill that led to the campsite, I stopped dead in my tracks. The night vision goggles revealed something that made my blood run cold. The Werner family was there. They sat around their campfire exactly as they had been the last time I'd seen them alive, but something was horribly wrong. They were too still, too perfectly arranged, like mannequins posed by someone who'd never seen real humans before. And they were facing outward, away from the fire, staring into the darkness with eyes that reflected my infrared light like mirrors. I fumbled for my radio, but before I could call for backup, one of them turned to look at me. It was the teenage daughter, Amy, but her neck rotated too far, a full 180 degrees, while her body remained perfectly still. When she smiled, I could see that her teeth had been filed to points. "Ranger Morrison," she said, her voice carrying impossibly well across the distance between us. "We've been waiting for you." The rest of the family began to turn then, each head swiveling on its axis with a wet, grinding sound. The father's face was gone, replaced by smooth skin with no features except for a mouth that opened too wide. The mother's limbs were too long, her arms reaching nearly to the ground as she stood. The teenage son's eyes had been replaced by dark holes that seemed to go on forever. But it was the grandmother that made me nearly vomit with terror. Eleanor Werner stood slowly, her arthritic joints moving with impossible fluidity, and I realized that something was wearing her like a suit. Her skin hung loose and baggy, and through the gaps, I could see something dark and wet moving underneath. "We've been waiting," she repeated, her voice the perfect mimicry of the concerned elderly woman who'd spoken to me just days before. "Come closer, Ranger Morrison. Come see what we've learned about the sounds in the dark." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The things that had been the Werner family began to move toward me, their movements all wrong, too fluid, too coordinated, as if they were being controlled by a single intelligence. As they approached, I could hear the chittering sound I've been hearing all week, but now I realized it wasn't coming from the canyon. It was coming from them. The sound was emerging from their mouths, a rapid-fire clicking and buzzing that formed patterns, almost like language. And as I listened, frozen in terror, I began to understand what they were saying. They were calling to something. Something big. Something that had been sleeping in the depths of the canyon for a very long time. And it was answering. The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate, a low thrumming that I felt in my bones. Rocks started falling from the canyon walls, and in the distance, I could hear something moving, something vast and ancient pulling itself up from the depths. The thing wearing Eleanor Werner's body stopped about 10 feet away from me and tilted its head in a gesture that was almost curious. "Do you know what lives in the deep places, Ranger Morrison?" it asked in her voice. Do you know what sleeps beneath the stone and earth, dreaming of the time when the stars are right? I tried to speak, but only a strangled whisper came out. What? What are you? We are the ones who prepare the way, it replied. We are the ones who call the sleeper to wake. And you are the one who will help us bring it to the surface. That's when I noticed the hole. Behind the arranged figures of the Werner family, the ground had opened up into a perfectly circular pit that definitely hadn't been there before. It was about 20 feet across, and from its depths came a smell that made me gag. Rotting meat mixed with something chemical and alien. The chittering sounds were coming from down there too, but magnified, as if hundreds of voices were all calling out at once. The family served their purpose. The Eleanor thing continued. They fed it, gave it strength. But it needs more. It needs someone who knows the park, who can bring others to feed the awakening. The other figures had formed a circle around me now, and I realized that their chittering had taken on a hypnotic quality. My vision began to blur, and I felt my will slipping away. Part of me wanted to walk to the edge of that hole and look down into the depths to see what was climbing up toward us through the darkness. But the small, stubborn part of my mind that had kept me alive through 6 years of night shifts fought back. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on at full power, sweeping the beam across the circle of transformed humans. They screamed. Not human screams, but the sound of something fundamental being torn apart. The light seemed to burn them, and I could see their borrowed flesh beginning to bubble and smoke. The thing wearing Eleanor Werner's body staggered backward, its form beginning to lose cohesion. The light, it shrieked in a voice that was no longer human. It burns. It reveals. I didn't wait to see what it revealed. I turned and ran, crashing through the brush toward where I left my truck. Behind me, I could hear them pursuing, but their movements had become uncoordinated, clumsy. Whatever they were weakened by the light. But the thing in the hole was not. As I ran, the ground continued to shake, and I could hear something enormous pulling itself up from the depths. Trees were falling, rocks were cascading down the canyon walls, and that alien smell was getting stronger. I risked a look back and saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A massive form was emerging from the hole, something that might have been an octopus if octopi were the size of office buildings and covered in eyes that glowed with their own sick light. Tentacles as thick as telephone poles were pulling it up from the depths, and where they touched the ground, the earth itself seemed to wither and die. I made it to my truck and gunned the engine, racing down the dirt road toward the main highway. In my rearview mirror, I could see the glow of those massive eyes rising above the tree line, and the night sky was full of shapes that might have been birds but moved too strangely to be anything natural. I called for backup as soon as I hit the highway, but by the time the state police and federal agents arrived, there was nothing to see. The hole was gone, the ground showing no signs of disturbance. Campsite 17 looked exactly as it had when the Werner family first disappeared. Empty tents, cold fire pit, no trace of the horrors I'd witnessed. They found my digital recorder in the brush where I dropped it during my escape. The first part of the recording was clear, my footsteps, my breathing, the sounds of the forest. But starting from the moment I'd crested the hill, there was only silence. 20 minutes of perfect, absolute silence, as if the recorder had been placed in a vacuum. The official report listed me as suffering from stress-induced hallucinations brought on by the pressure of the Werner family disappearance. I was given a psychological evaluation and 2 weeks of mandatory leave. When I returned to work, I was transferred to day shifts. But I know what I saw, and I know it's not over. The Werner family is still listed as missing, but I've been monitoring missing persons reports from parks across the country. The pattern is always the same, families disappearing without a trace, often preceded by reports of unusual sounds or sudden silence, and always near places where the geology reports mention deep cave systems or underground formations. It's spreading. Whatever I saw that night, whatever was climbing up from the depths beneath Canyon Mesa, it's not the only one. They're waking up all across the country, all across the world. The stars are coming, right? Just like the thing wearing Eleanor Werner's body said they would. I've been preparing. I've stockpiled flashlights, high-powered lanterns, anything that might hold them back when they come again. Because they will come again. The awakening has begun, And those of us who've seen the truth are the only ones who can try to stop it. If you're reading this, if you work in any of the national parks or spend time in remote areas, watch for the signs. Listen for the silence. And if you hear that chittering sound in the darkness, if you see eyes that reflect light like mirrors, don't try to be a hero. Run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because some things are better left sleeping in the deep places of the earth. And once they wake up, they're always hungry. I'm Daniel Reeves, Senior Ranger at Blackwood Forest State Park, and I've seen things in these woods that would make a grown man weep. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found in the deep timber last October. It started with a missing logger. Tommy Breslin had been cutting timber on the northern edge of the park, working under a special permit to clear some diseased trees that were threatening to spread their infection to the healthy forest. Tommy was a third-generation logger, knew these woods better than most folks know their own backyards. He'd been working alone, which wasn't unusual for a man of his experience. But when he failed to return home that evening, his wife called the ranger station. I'd gone out at first light to check on him, following the logging road to where his truck was parked. His chainsaw was there, still warm, sitting next to a massive oak that had been half-cut. The tree was easily 300 years old, one of the giants that had been here since before the first settlers arrived. But something was wrong with it. The cut Tommy had made was bleeding. Not sap blood. Real, red blood that pooled at the base of the tree and soaked into the forest floor. I'd seen trees weep sap before, especially when they were diseased or damaged, but this was different. This was arterial bleeding, pumping in rhythm like a heartbeat. I called for backup and cordoned off the area, but the investigation that followed raised more questions than answers. There was no sign of Tommy anywhere. His truck keys were still in his pocket, his lunch was uneaten, and his cell phone showed no record of any calls or messages. The man had simply vanished, leaving behind only that half-cut, bleeding tree. The State Forestry Department sent a team to examine the tree, and what they found defied explanation. The interior of the oak contained what appeared to be a circulatory system, actual blood vessels running through the wood like veins and arteries. When they took samples for analysis, the tree began to make sounds. At first, it was just creaking and groaning, the normal sounds of a damaged tree settling. But as the hours passed, the sounds became more complex, more human. By sunset, the tree was crying. I don't mean figuratively. I mean it was producing actual tears, clear, salty water that ran down the bark in steady streams. And the sounds it made were unmistakably those of a person in profound grief. Low, keening wails that seemed to come from deep within the trunk, rising and falling like sobs. The forestry team packed up and left that night, claiming they needed to analyze their samples in the lab. But I could see the fear in their eyes. They found something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world, and they wanted nothing more than to get as far away from it as possible. But I couldn't leave. This was my forest, my responsibility. And somewhere out there, Tommy Breslin was still missing. That night, I set up camp near the bleeding tree, intending to keep watch and document any further changes. I brought my digital recorder, my camera, and enough supplies to last through the weekend. If something supernatural was happening in my forest, I was going to get to the bottom of it. As darkness fell, the trees' crying grew louder, more desperate. The sound echoed through the forest, and I began to notice something disturbing. Other trees were responding, their own sounds joining the chorus of grief. Not just the oaks, but the maples, the birches, even the young saplings. The entire forest was weeping. I tried to record the phenomenon, but my equipment kept malfunctioning. The digital recorder would only capture static, and my camera showed nothing but darkness, even when I could clearly see the trees swaying and moving in ways that had nothing to do with wind. Around midnight, I heard footsteps approaching through the underbrush. Heavy, deliberate steps that crunched through the fallen leaves. I called out, hoping it might be Tommy, but the footsteps stopped just outside the circle of light from my campfire. Tommy. I called again. Tommy, is that you? The answer came from the bleeding tree itself, Tommy's voice emerging from somewhere deep within the trunk. Danny? Danny, help me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The voice was muffled, distant, but unmistakably Tommy's. I approached the tree slowly, my flashlight beam shaking in my trembling hand. Tommy, where are you? How are you talking to me? I'm inside, his voice replied, filled with terror and desperation. I'm inside the tree, Danny. It pulled me in when I started cutting it. I can't get out. I can't move. I can feel myself becoming part of it. I examined the half-finished cut Tommy had made, shining my light into the gap. The interior of the tree was wrong. Instead of the concentric rings of growth you'd expect to see, there were what looked like chambers, hollow spaces filled with a thick red liquid. And floating in that liquid, I saw an eye. A human eye, staring back at me with desperate intelligence. Jesus Christ, I whispered, stumbling backward. Don't leave me, Danny, Tommy's voice pleaded from within the tree. Please don't leave me like this. Cut me out. Get me out of here. I looked at the abandoned chainsaw, then back at the tree. The bleeding had increased, and I could see more eyes now, dozens of them, blinking in the red liquid that filled the hollow spaces in the trunk. Some of them looked human, but others were different. Larger, with pupils that weren't quite round, and irises that shifted color in the flashlight beam. How long have you been in there, Tommy? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, he replied. Time moves differently in here. Sometimes I think I've been here for hours, sometimes it feels like years. But I'm not alone, Danny. There are others. So many others. As if summoned by his words, more voices began to emerge from the tree. Men and women, children, all crying out for help, all begging to be freed from their wooden prison. I recognized some of the voices, hikers who'd gone missing over the years, campers who'd never returned from their trips, even some of my fellow rangers who disappeared during routine patrols. The tree wasn't just bleeding. It was feeding. The forest is alive, Danny, Tommy continued, his voice growing weaker. It's been alive for centuries, maybe longer. The trees, they're not really trees. There's something else, something that learned to look like trees to hide from the world above. And they're hungry. They're always hungry. I looked around at the other trees, and for the first time, I really saw them. The way their branches moved without wind, the way their bark seemed to pulse with hidden life, the way their roots had grown in patterns that looked almost like neural networks. The entire forest was a single organism, and every tree was part of its vast, alien intelligence. The logging, I said, understanding flooding through me. You were cutting into it. You were hurting it. It fought back, Tommy confirmed. It pulled me inside, made me part of itself. But I'm still me, Danny. I can still think, still feel. And I can feel what it's planning. What is it planning? To spread, to grow, to replace more and more of the forest with itself until there's nothing left but the crying trees. And then it's going to spread beyond the forest, into the towns, the cities. It's going to remake the world in its own image. The other voices in the tree grew louder, more urgent. They were trying to tell me something, but their words were becoming garbled and human. I realized with horror that they were losing themselves, becoming absorbed into the greater consciousness of the forest entity. You have to burn it, Danny, Tommy's voice said, and I could hear the desperation in it. Burn the whole forest before it spreads. It's the only way to stop it. I stared at him, or at the tree that contained him, in shock. I can't burn down the entire forest, Tommy. Do you know how many acres we're talking about? How many innocent animals would die? They're not innocent anymore, he replied, his voice growing fainter. Look around you, Danny. Really look. I turned my flashlight toward the surrounding woods and saw movement in the shadows. Animals were approaching, deer, rabbits, squirrels, even a black bear. But they moved wrong, their gaits too coordinated, too purposeful. As they stepped into the light, I saw that their eyes were the same as the ones in the tree, too large, too intelligent, with irises that shifted color like oil on water. The forest had already begun to change them, to make them part of itself. It's too late, I whispered. No, Tommy said, his voice now barely audible. Not too late. Not yet. There's still time, but you have to act now. Before sunrise. Before it completes the connection. What connection? The root system. It's been growing, spreading underneath the entire forest for decades. Tonight, it reaches the highway. Tomorrow, it reaches the town. Once it connects to the human population centers. His voice trailed off, but I understood. The entity would have access to thousands of people, all the bodies and minds it needed to fuel its expansion across the continent. I looked at the chainsaw again, then at the surrounding trees. Even if I could bring myself to destroy the forest, how could one man with a single saw hope to stop something this vast? There's another way, Tommy said, as if reading my thoughts. The heart tree. The original one, the first tree it inhabited. Destroy that, and the whole network collapses. Where is it? The clearing. You know, the one where the old Indian burial ground used to be. It's been there since before the settlers came, maybe since before humans walked this continent. That's where it all started. I knew the clearing he meant. It was deep in the forest, accessible only by foot, a place where the trees formed a perfect circle around a single massive oak that was older than anything else in the forest. I'd always felt uneasy there, as if I was trespassing on sacred ground. How do I destroy something that old, that powerful? Fire, Tommy whispered. But not ordinary fire. You need to burn it from the inside. Let the flames consume the root system. There's a way in, a hollow at the base of the trunk. You have to crawl inside in. His voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound that made my blood freeze. A wet, tearing noise like flesh being pulled apart. The eyes in the tree began to close, one by one, and I realized that Tommy was being absorbed completely, his consciousness dissolving into the greater mind of the forest entity. The animals around me were getting closer, their alien eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. I could hear more movement in the darkness beyond, larger shapes crashing through the underbrush, converging on my position. I grabbed my pack and ran. The forest had become a maze of reaching branches and grasping roots. Trees that I'd walked past countless times before now seemed to lean inward, trying to block my path. More than once, I felt bark scrape against my skin as branches moved to intercept me, leaving cuts that burned with an unnatural cold. Behind me, I could hear the pursuit, not just the transformed animals, but the trees themselves. Roots erupted from the ground to trip me, branches whipped through the air like tentacles, and everywhere, the crying grew louder. The entire forest was weeping now, a chorus of inhuman sorrow that seemed to press against my skull like a migraine. I had to stop several times to consult my compass and GPS, but even my instrument seemed affected by whatever force emanated from the trees. The compass needle spun wildly, and my GPS showed my location jumping randomly across the map. I was navigating by memory and instinct alone, following game trails and half-remembered landmarks toward the heart of the forest. As I ran, I began to understand the true scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just one entity, it was part of something much larger. The crying trees were everywhere now, and I could hear their voices in languages I didn't recognize, in sounds that hurt to listen to. How many forests had already been consumed? How many wilderness areas around the world were really just extensions of this ancient, hungry consciousness? The clearing appeared ahead of me, just as dawn was beginning to break through the canopy. It looked exactly as I remembered, a perfect circle of ancient trees surrounding a single massive oak that dwarfed everything around it. But now I could see it for what it really was. The heart tree wasn't just old, it was alien. Its bark had a metallic sheen, and patterns of light pulsed beneath its surface like circuitry. The roots that emerged from its base were thick as subway tunnels, and they glowed with the same bioluminescent light I could see in the other trees. This was the source, the original point of infection that had been slowly consuming the forest for centuries. At the base of the trunk, just as Tommy had said, there was an opening. Not a natural hollow, but something that looked almost like a mouth, lined with what might have been teeth or thorns. As I approached, the opening dilated slightly, as if inviting me inside. I could hear voices coming from within, thousands of them, maybe millions, all the people who had been absorbed by the entity over the centuries. They were calling to me, begging me to join them, promising that the absorption was painless, that I would become part of something greater than myself. But underneath their pleas, I could hear something else. A deeper voice, ancient and vast, speaking in a language that predated human speech. It was the voice of the forest itself, and it was hungry. I pulled out the emergency flares I always carried and broke them open, spreading the phosphorus compound around the base of the tree. The chemical fire would burn hot enough to ignite even green wood, and once it caught hold of the root system, the tree sensed what I was doing. The opening at its base suddenly contracted, sealing itself shut, and the entire clearing began to shake. Roots erupted from the ground around me, trying to knock me off my feet, while branches descended from above like striking snakes. I lit the first flare and threw it into the phosphorus I'd spread. The chemical fire caught immediately, spreading in a bright white ring around the base of the heart tree. The entity's scream was like nothing I'd ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a wail of pain and rage that shattered every piece of glass on my equipment. The fire began to climb the trunk, and I could see the bioluminescent patterns beneath the bark flickering and dying. But the entity wasn't going down without a fight. The other trees in the clearing began to move, their massive trunks sliding across the ground like they were on rails, trying to surround me and cut off my escape. More roots burst from the earth. These ones different. They moved with purpose and intelligence, coiling around my legs and arms like serpents. I could feel them trying to penetrate my skin, to inject me with whatever substance they used to begin the absorption process. I lit my remaining flares and threw them at the approaching trees. The fire spread quickly, jumping from trunk to trunk, as the alien would prove to be incredibly flammable. Within minutes, the entire clearing was ablaze, and the screaming of the dying entity was so loud I thought my eardrums might burst. But as the heart tree began to collapse, I saw something that made me realize the true horror of what I was facing. The fire wasn't just burning the wood, it was releasing the people trapped inside. Thousands of human forms, translucent and ghostly, rose from the flames like smoke. They looked at me with expressions of gratitude and relief before dissipating into the morning air. Tommy was among them. He paused long enough to mouth the words, "Thank you," before his spirit faded away, finally at peace. The fire spread outward from the clearing, following the root network that connected all the trees in the forest. I could hear the entity's death screams echoing from miles away as the flames consumed its vast body. But I also knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The crying trees weren't unique to Blackwood Forest. They were everywhere, in national parks and wilderness areas around the world, slowly growing and spreading, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. What I destroyed was just one tentacle of a global organism that had been preparing for decades, maybe centuries, to remake the world. I stumbled out of the burning forest as the sun rose, my clothes singed and my lungs full of smoke. The local fire department was already responding to reports of the blaze, and I told them what I could, that there had been an accident with some emergency flares, that the fire had spread faster than I'd anticipated. They bought the story, mostly because the alternative was too unbelievable to consider. The official report listed the fire as an accident, and I was given a commendation for my efforts to contain it before it spread beyond the park boundaries. But I know the truth, and I know it's not over. I've been monitoring reports from other forests, other parks, looking for signs of the crying trees. The pattern is always the same: missing persons, strange sounds in the woods, trees that bleed when cut. The entity is still out there, still growing, still preparing. I've resigned from the Park Service and started my own organization, a small group of people who've encountered similar phenomena and survived to tell about it. We call ourselves the Verdant Watch, and we're dedicated to identifying and destroying the crying trees before they can complete their global network. It's dangerous work. We've lost 3 members in the past year, absorbed by entities we couldn't destroy in time. But we've also had successes, forest fires that were attributed to natural causes but were actually controlled burns designed to eliminate alien infestations. If you work in forestry, if you spend time in remote wilderness areas, watch for the signs. Trees that move without wind, sounds of crying or sobbing coming from the forest, missing persons reports that follow strange patterns. And if you ever hear the trees crying, don't investigate alone. Call us. We'll come running. Because the crying trees are still out there, still spreading, still hungry. And if we don't stop them soon, the day will come when every forest on Earth will be part of their vast, alien consciousness. The day when the trees stop crying and start screaming. I've been a ranger at Copper Ridge National Forest for 15 years, and I know every path, every game trail, every deer track in these mountains. I've memorized the topographical maps, walked every official trail at least 100 times, and bushwhacked through areas where no human foot has touched ground in decades. But the path I found last Tuesday wasn't on any map, wasn't in any of our records, and according to the geological surveys, couldn't exist. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm about to document something that will either save lives or get me committed to a psychiatric facility. Maybe both. It started with a Henderson expedition, a group of graduate students from the university's geology department, led by Professor James Whitmore, had been conducting a mineral survey in the remote eastern section of the forest. They were experienced hikers, well-equipped, and had filed proper permits for a 2-week backcountry research trip. Standard procedure required them to radio in every evening at 6 p.m. sharp. On Tuesday, they missed their check-in. Wednesday morning, I hiked out to their last known position, an area of exposed granite about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. Their base camp was there, tents set up properly, equipment organized, food stored correctly. But no people, and no indication of where they might have gone. What bothered me most were the backpacks. 5 of them, lined up neatly beside the tents, packed as if the team was preparing for a day hike. But their contents were wrong. Each pack contained the same items: a single water bottle, a flashlight, a notebook, and a compass. Nothing else. No food, no emergency supplies, no scientific equipment. Just those 4 items, identical in every pack. I radioed for search and rescue, but while waiting for the team to arrive, I decided to scout the immediate area for any sign of which direction the students had gone. That's when I found the path. It started just beyond their campsite, at the base of a cliff face that I knew for certain had been solid rock the day before. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, and it led directly into the cliff, not around it, not over it, but into it through an opening that shouldn't have been there. The opening wasn't a cave exactly. It was more like a crack in reality itself, a gap between the rock face and something else. When I shined my flashlight into it, the beam seemed to stretch forever, illuminating a tunnel that curved gently downward and disappeared into absolute darkness. The air coming from the opening was wrong. It was warm, much warmer than it should have been, and it carried scents that didn't belong in any mountain forest. Salt air, exotic flowers, and underneath it all, something organic and unpleasant, like meat left too long in the sun. My first instinct was to mark the location and wait for the search team. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the soft earth at the tunnel's entrance, 5 sets of boots, all heading inward. The Henderson expedition had gone into the impossible path. I tried to radio for backup, but my radio was picking up only static. Worse, the static seemed to form patterns, almost like voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. When I checked my GPS, it showed my location as being somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Every instinct I had told me to wait for help, to not enter the tunnel alone. But 5 people were missing, and they were my responsibility. I attached a signal mirror to a tree near the tunnel entrance, left a note explaining what I'd found, and entered the path. The tunnel was longer than it had any right to be. I walked for what felt like hours, following the gentle downward curve deeper and deeper into the earth. My flashlight beam revealed smooth walls that looked like they'd been carved by water, but there was no sign of moisture anywhere. The air grew warmer as I descended, and the strange scents became stronger. After what my watch claimed was 3 hours of walking, I came to a junction. The main tunnel continued straight ahead, but a smaller passage branched off to the right. At the junction, someone had left a message carved into the wall. Followed the compass. Taking right path. J.W. Professor Whitmore. At least I was on the right track. I took the right passage, and immediately noticed that the walls here were different. Instead of smooth stone, they were covered in what looked like root systems, thick organic cables that pulsed with a faint bioluminescent glow. The pulsing followed a rhythm, like a slow heartbeat, and I realized with growing horror that the entire tunnel was alive. The passage opened into a vast underground cavern, and what I saw there challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a forest, but not like any forest that existed on the surface. The trees were massive, easily as large as redwoods, but their bark was translucent, revealing complex circulatory systems beneath. Instead of leaves, they bore clusters of what looked like eyes, thousands of them, all different sizes and colors. And the eyes were moving, tracking my progress as I entered their domain. The forest floor was carpeted with what I initially thought was moss, but as I got closer, I realized it was composed of tiny mouths, each one no bigger than a coin, all whispering in voices too quiet to understand. The combined effect was a constant susurrus of sound that made my skin crawl. In the center of the forest, I could see light, not the bioluminescent glow of the trees, but actual sunlight, streaming down from what appeared to be an opening in the cavern ceiling far above. But that was impossible. According to my GPS, when it had been working, I was at least 2,000 feet underground. I followed a path through the whispering moss toward the light, and that's where I found them. The Henderson expedition was there, all 5 of them, standing in a circle around what looked like a pool of liquid mercury. But something was horribly wrong with them. They were too still, too perfectly positioned like statues. And their eyes. Their eyes had been replaced with the same type of eyes that grew on the trees, large, multifaceted, constantly moving. When they turned to look at me, all 5 heads moved in perfect synchronization. Ranger Vasquez, Professor Whitmore said, his voice perfectly normal despite the alien eyes. "We've been waiting for you. Professor, what happened to you? What is this place?" "This is the deep path," he replied, gesturing to the impossible forest around us. "The route between worlds. We've been chosen to serve as guides for others who will follow." One of the students, a young woman named Lisa Chen, stepped forward. Her movements were fluid, too graceful, as if she was floating rather than walking. "The path appears to those who are ready," she said. "Those who have the knowledge and experience to help others make the journey safely. You've walked these mountains for 15 years, Ranger Vasquez. You know every trail, every landmark. You're exactly what the deep path needs. I don't understand. Journey to where?" Professor Whitmore smiled, and I could see that his teeth had been replaced with something that looked like crystalline formations. "To the other side, of course. To the places that exist between the spaces we know. The deep path connects all wild places, all the forgotten corners of the world where the barriers are thin. We're the shepherds now, guiding travelers safely through the darkness." As he spoke, I began to notice more figures moving through the translucent trees. They appear to be human, but like the Henderson team, they've been changed. Some had the multifaceted eyes, others had skin that glowed with internal light, and a few had limbs that bent in impossible directions. All of them were watching me with expressions of benevolent patience. "How many people are down here?" I asked. "Hundreds," Lisa replied. "Maybe thousands. Every hiker who ever felt the call of the deep wilderness. Everyone who ever wondered what lay beyond the map trails. We all found our way here eventually. And you can't leave. Why would we want to?" Professor Whitmore laughed. "This is paradise, Ranger Vasquez. No cold, no hunger, no pain. And the work is rewarding. Every person we guide through the deep path becomes part of something greater than themselves." That's when I understood. These people weren't guides, they were bait. Lures designed to draw others into whatever had taken them. And now they wanted me to join them. The pool of mercury at the center of the clearing began to ripple, and something rose from its depths. It was vaguely humanoid but enormous, easily 12 feet tall, with skin that shifted and flowed like liquid metal. Where its face should have been, there was instead a collection of the same multifaceted eyes I'd seen on the trees and the transformed humans. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once, resonating through the cavern like thunder. "Welcome, guardian of the surface pass. We have great need of your knowledge." I backed away, but the circle of transformed humans closed around me. They weren't threatening, exactly, but they weren't going to let me leave either. "The barriers grow thin," the entity continued. "Soon, the deep path will extend to every wilderness area on your world. We require guides who know the surface routes, who can help travelers find their way to the entry points." "What are you?" I managed to whisper. "We are the shepherds of the between. We tend the paths that connect all wild places, all the spaces where your kind dreams of escape from civilization. And now we extend our network to include your world. The transformed humans began to move closer, their alien eyes fixed on me with hypnotic intensity. I could feel my will beginning to slip away, my resistance crumbling under the weight of their collective gaze. But then I remembered something. The signal mirror I'd attached to the tree at the tunnel entrance. If search and rescue had found it, if they'd followed my trail. They're coming for me, I said. Other rangers. They'll find this place. The entity's massive form shifted, and for the first time, I detected what might have been concern in its voice. The surface dwellers are not ready for the deep path. They lack the preparation necessary for safe passage. Then let me go. Let me guide them away from the entrances. I can keep people away from the paths. Professor Whitmore shook his head sadly. I'm afraid it doesn't work that way, Ranger Vasquez. Once you've seen the deep path, you can't unsee it. Once you know the truth about the spaces between worlds, you can't go back to pretending the surface is all there is. The circle of transformed humans was closing in now, and I could see that their fingertips had been replaced with the same crystalline formations as their teeth. They were going to touch me, inject me with whatever substance they used to begin the transformation process. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled out my emergency flare and ignited it. The brilliant red light filled the cavern, and the effect on its inhabitants was immediate and dramatic. The transformed humans screamed and scattered, their alien eyes apparently unable to tolerate the intense illumination. The entity itself recoiled, its form becoming less solid, more dispersed. The light burns, it roared. The surface light destroys the connection. I didn't wait to see what else the flare might do. I ran, following the path back through the whispering moss toward the tunnel entrance. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not the transformed humans, but something else, something that moved through the alien forest with the sound of breaking branches and tearing earth. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out, the walls pressing closer as if trying to prevent my escape. My flare was burning down, and I could feel the temperature dropping as I climbed back toward the surface. When the flare finally died, I was plunged into absolute darkness, but I pressed on, following the tunnel by feel. I emerged from the impossible opening just as the sun was setting, and I've never been so grateful to see normal sky and normal trees. The search and rescue team was there, setting up their equipment, preparing to follow my trail into the depths. Don't go in there, I told them, gasping for breath. Seal it off. Nobody goes into that tunnel. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. But when they shined their lights into the opening, they saw nothing but solid rock. The path to the deep path had closed, at least for now. The official report listed the Henderson expedition as victims of a flash flood that swept them into an underground river system. Their bodies were never recovered, and the case was eventually closed. I was commended for my thorough search efforts and given a few days off to recover from the stress. But I know the truth, and I know it's not over. I've been monitoring missing persons reports from wilderness areas across the country, looking for patterns. People who disappear near geological anomalies, hikers who vanish from well-marked trails, search efforts that find no trace despite perfect weather conditions. The deep path is still out there, still opening new entrances, still luring people into its alien embrace. I've started carrying military-grade flares on all my patrols, and I've been training other rangers in what to look for. Most of them think I'm paranoid, but a few have seen things that make them wonder. Strange openings that appear overnight and disappear by morning. Trails that lead to places that shouldn't exist. And always, the feeling that something is watching from the deep places of the forest. The deep path is patient. It's been connecting wild places for longer than human civilization has existed, and it's learned that the best way to expand is slowly, carefully, taking only those who won't be missed immediately. But it's growing bolder now, opening more entrances, taking more people. If you hike in remote areas, if you explore the backcountry, watch for paths that aren't on the maps. If you find an opening that shouldn't be there, don't investigate. Don't follow strange trails into the darkness. And if you hear whispers coming from the ground, if you see lights that don't belong, turn around and never look back. Because once you've seen the deep path, it never stops calling to you. And sooner or later, everyone who's seen it finds their way back. Even me. I can hear it now as I write this. The whispers in the wind, the promise of wonders beyond imagination. The knowledge that there are places between the spaces we know, paths that lead to forests older than time itself. The deep path is calling, and I don't know how much longer I can resist. If you find this journal, if I disappear like all the others, remember what I've told you. The paths are real, and they're spreading. And they're always hungry for new guides. I'm Roy Blackwood, and I've been the night watchman at the Granite Falls Dam and Recreation Area for 12 years. It's a lonely job. 8 hours alone in a concrete bunker, monitoring water levels and security cameras, making sure the dam's structural integrity remains sound through the long mountain nights. Most rangers wouldn't take the position. The isolation gets to people, drives them to hear things that aren't there, and see shadows that don't exist. But I've always been comfortable with solitude. Or at least, I was until the walls started watching me back. The trouble began 3 weeks ago with the Kellerman family. They've been camping at Site 23, a popular spot near the lake where families could fish and swim during the day. Tom Kellerman had called the station around 10 p.m. to report unusual sounds coming from the dam structure itself. It's like something's moving around inside the concrete, he told me over the radio. Scratching, scraping sounds. My kids are scared, and honestly, so am I. I'd assured him it was probably just thermal expansion. Concrete makes all sorts of noises as it cools at night. Old structures like the Granite Falls Dam were notorious for their acoustic properties. Sound could travel through the massive walls in unexpected ways, making normal settling sound seem amplified and alien. But Tom wasn't satisfied with that explanation. This isn't settling, Ranger Blackwood. This is something alive. Something big. You need to come check it out. I promised to investigate in the morning, but when dawn came, the Kellerman family was gone. Their campsite looked like they'd packed up in a hurry. Tents collapsed but not folded, gear scattered around their car, food left out where it would attract bears. Tom's radio was on the picnic table, still turned on, hissing with static. They'd left a note taped to their car windshield. Had to leave. Couldn't sleep. The sounds got worse after midnight. Something was trying to get into our tent. Don't camp here. Tell people to stay away. I'd filed a routine report and forgotten about the incident until the next family reported similar experiences. Then another. Within 2 weeks, we'd had 7 separate reports of campers being driven away by sounds coming from the dam structure, scratching, scraping, and worst of all, what several witnesses described as whispering voices speaking a language that hurt to hear. The dam's chief engineer, a gruff man named Pete Hartwell, had insisted on a full structural inspection. 40 years I've been working on this dam, he told me. Never heard sounds like what these people are describing. If something's moving inside the concrete, we need to know what it is. The inspection had turned up nothing. The concrete was sound, the rebar was intact, and there were no signs of internal stress or damage. But the acoustic tests had revealed something disturbing. When sound waves were directed at certain sections of the dam, they didn't echo back the way they should have. Instead, they seemed to be absorbed, as if there were hollow spaces inside the supposedly solid concrete. That's impossible, Pete had muttered, reviewing the test results for the 10th time. I supervised the pour myself. Every cubic yard of that concrete was accounted for. There are no voids, no chambers, no spaces where anything could hide, but the evidence was undeniable. Something was inside the dam, something that had been there long enough to create a complex network of tunnels and chambers throughout the massive structure. And based on the size of the spaces revealed by the acoustic testing, whatever was in there was big. That's when I volunteered for the night watch. The ranger station was built into the dam itself, a small concrete facility that monitored the structure's vital signs 24 hours a day. Water pressure gauges, seismic monitors, temperature sensors, all designed to detect any change in the dam's condition that might signal structural failure. If something was living inside the concrete, the monitoring equipment would pick up its movements. For the first week, everything seemed normal. The gauges showed steady readings, the cameras revealed nothing unusual, and the only sounds were the familiar hum of machinery and the distant rush of water flowing through the spillways. I was beginning to think the acoustic test had been wrong. that the hollow spaces were just anomalies in the data. Then, on my 8th night, I heard the scratching. It started around midnight, a sound like fingernails on a blackboard amplified through tons of concrete. It was coming from the walls themselves, and as I listened, I realized it was moving. The sound traveled from the east wall to the north wall, then up toward the ceiling, as if something was crawling through passages inside the structure. I checked the monitoring equipment, but the gauges showed no unusual vibrations, no signs of movement within the dam. According to the instruments, nothing was happening. But the scratching continued, growing louder and more insistent. That's when I noticed the security cameras were picking up something strange. Not inside the ranger station, but in the dam's interior passages, the maintenance tunnels that ran through the structure to allow access to critical systems. Shapes were moving through those tunnels, shadows that didn't correspond to any known structural features. I switched between camera feeds trying to track the movement, but whatever was in there seemed to know where the cameras were. It stayed just out of direct view, showing me only glimpses, a pale appendage disappearing around a corner, a suggestion of massive bulk squeezing through spaces that should have been too small to accommodate it. The scratching stopped abruptly at 3 a.m., replaced by something worse, voices. They were speaking in whispers so quiet I had to strain to hear them, but they were definitely coming from inside the walls. At first, I thought it might be some kind of radio interference, but as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices were speaking in unison, all saying the same words at the same time. And they were saying my name. Roy Blackwood, the whispers chanted. Roy Blackwood in the little room. Roy Blackwood all alone. We see you, Roy Blackwood. We see you sleeping. I wasn't sleeping. I was wide awake, heart hammering, trying to figure out how anything inside the dam could know my name. But the voices continued their chant, and I began to notice that they were getting closer. The sound was traveling through the walls toward the ranger station, following the same path the scratching had taken. I tried to radio for backup, but the radio was picking up only static. When I tried my cell phone, it showed no signal despite being in an area where I normally had full coverage. The voices in the walls were interfering with all forms of communication, cutting me off from the outside world. At 4 a.m., they reached the ranger station. The whispers were coming from directly behind the walls now, so close I could feel the vibrations through the concrete. But they were no longer chanting my name. Now they were having a conversation, discussing me as if I wasn't there. He's afraid, one voice whispered. Good. Fear makes the meat tender. How long since we've had fresh food? Another replied. Too long. The campers run away too quickly now. This one can't run. This one is trapped in the little room. I grabbed my flashlight and checked every inch of the station, looking for any cracks or openings where something might get through. The concrete appeared solid, but as I examined the walls more carefully, I began to notice something that chilled me to the bone. The walls were warm. Not just warm, hot, as if something with a high body temperature was pressed against the other side. And in some places, the concrete seemed to be moving slightly, bulging outward as if under pressure from within. That's when I saw the first scratch mark appear. It started as a thin line in the concrete, no wider than a pencil mark. But as I watched, it began to deepen and widen, as if something on the other side was carving through the wall. More lines appeared, forming letters, spelling out the message that had started this nightmare. We see you sleeping. But I wasn't sleeping. I was standing right there, watching the words appear, which meant they could see through the concrete. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever was inside the dam didn't just live in the hollow spaces, it was the hollow spaces. The acoustic tests hadn't detected chambers and tunnels, they detected the body of something enormous, something that had somehow integrated itself into the structure of the dam itself. The concrete wasn't just containing it, the concrete was it. I backed away from the walls as more scratch marks appeared, forming new messages. 40 years we've been growing. 40 years becoming part of the stone. 40 years waiting for the right moment. Tonight we emerge. The temperature in the station began to rise as whatever was in the walls generated more heat. The monitoring equipment started going crazy, alarms blaring as sensors detected massive structural changes throughout the dam. But the changes weren't mechanical, they were biological. The dam was coming alive. I could see it now, the concrete walls beginning to pulse like a massive heart. Veins of some dark substance were spreading through the structure, creating new patterns in the concrete. And the walls were getting thinner, more translucent, as if the thing inside was absorbing the material and converting it into part of itself. Through the increasingly transparent walls, I could see movement, not individual creatures, but parts of a single massive organism. Tentacles as thick as tree trunks wound through spaces that had once been solid concrete. Clusters of eyes, each one the size of a dinner plate, were embedded in what had once been the dam's foundation. And at the center of it all, a massive intelligence that had been patient enough to spend 40 years slowly replacing the dam with itself. The scratching sounds returned, but now they were coming from all directions. The entity was carving new passages, creating openings that would allow it to reach into the ranger station. In minutes, maybe seconds, the walls would be thin enough for it to break through. I had one chance. The dam's emergency systems included explosive charges designed to create controlled demolitions in case of catastrophic structural failure. If I could reach the detonation controls, I might be able to damage the entity enough to escape. But as I moved toward the control panel, the walls around the station began to cave inward, not collapsing but reshaping themselves, forming what looked like the interior of a massive mouth. The concrete was becoming soft and organic, taking on the texture of living tissue. The scratched messages on the walls were changing too. Too late to run. Too late to hide. We hunger. The walls were closing in now, the ranger station becoming a trap designed to deliver me directly into the entity's digestive system. I could see rows of teeth forming in what had once been concrete, calcium deposits that the creature had shaped into instruments of consumption. I reached the control panel just as the first tentacle broke through the wall behind me. It was massive, easily 3 feet in diameter, covered in what looked like concrete dust but felt warm and wet to the touch. As it coiled around my waist, I could see that its surface was covered in tiny mouths, all of them whispering my name. With my last moment of freedom, I slammed my fist down on the emergency detonation button. The explosion was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not just the sound and force of conventional explosives, but something else, a scream of pain and rage that seemed to come from the earth itself. The entity's hold on me loosened as it recoiled from the damage, and I was thrown clear of the ranger station as the entire structure began to collapse. But the explosion had done more than just damage the creature. It had revealed its true scope. As sections of the dam crumbled away, I could see the extent of what had been hidden inside. The entity wasn't just part of the dam. It was the size of the entire dam, a creature hundreds of feet long that had somehow squeezed itself into the concrete structure and spent decades slowly replacing it with living tissue. The water from the reservoir began pouring through the damaged structure, and where it touched the entity's exposed flesh, steam rose in great clouds. The creature was vulnerable to water. Ironic, given that it had chosen to inhabit a dam. But then I realized the truth. It hadn't chosen to inhabit the dam. It had been trapped there. 40 years ago, when the dam was being constructed, the workers had poured concrete over something they shouldn't have. Something they'd found in the excavation, something too big and too strange to report to their supervisors. They'd buried it alive in thousands of tons of concrete, thinking they were disposing of a problem. Instead, they'd given it time to grow, to adapt, to slowly convert its prison into an extension of itself. The entity's screams grew louder as more water poured over it, and I could see its flesh beginning to dissolve wherever the liquid touched. But it wasn't going to die quietly. As its physical form broke down, something else was emerging, a cloud of spores or seeds, tiny particles that glowed with the same organic light I'd seen in the concrete. The particles were spreading, carried by the wind and water, drifting toward the nearby forest and the camping areas downstream. Each one was a piece of the entity, a fragment of its consciousness that could take root somewhere new and begin the process all over again. I watched in horror as the spores settled on trees, on rocks, on the ground itself. Wherever they landed, the affected area began to change, taking on the same warm, organic texture that had transformed the dam. The entity wasn't dying. It was reproducing, spreading itself across the entire recreation area. I ran toward my truck, but as I passed through areas where the spores had settled, I could feel them trying to attach to my skin to begin the same conversion process they were performing on the environment. The whispers followed me, no longer coming from inside walls, but from the infected ground beneath my feet. "You cannot escape us, Roy Blackwood," they said. "We are in the water now, in the soil, in the air you breathe. Soon, everything will be part of us." I made it to my truck and drove as fast as I could toward the main highway, but in my rearview mirror, I could see the infection spreading. Trees were changing color, their bark taking on the pale, fleshy tone of the entity's hide. The road itself was beginning to pulse with organic rhythm. When I reached the highway, I called for emergency services, reporting a catastrophic dam failure and potential environmental contamination. Fire trucks, hazmat teams, and National Guard units were dispatched to the area, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing to see. The dam appeared normal. The concrete was intact, the water levels were stable, and there were no signs of structural damage. The officials who investigated found my story impossible to believe, especially when their own inspection showed no evidence of the disaster I described. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't over. Over the following weeks, I monitored news reports from the area around Granite Falls. Hikers began reporting strange experiences: trees that felt warm to the touch, ground that pulsed with hidden life, whispers coming from inside rocks and concrete structures. Several people went missing, their last known locations all within the zone where I'd seen the spores settle. I tried to warn the authorities, but my credibility was shot. The official report listed me as suffering from acute stress disorder brought on by years of isolation duty. I was given early retirement and a pension, and strongly encouraged to seek psychiatric treatment. But I kept watching, and I kept learning. The entity at Granite Falls wasn't unique. Over the following months, I found reports of similar incidents at dams and concrete structures around the country. Workers who disappeared during construction projects. Structures that made sounds they shouldn't make. And always the pattern of gradual infection, slow conversion of the surrounding area. They're not just in dams either. Any large concrete structure, bridges, tunnels, government buildings, could potentially house one of these entities. We've been building their prisons and their nurseries for decades, unknowingly providing them with a perfect environment to grow and spread. I've started an online forum for people who've had similar experiences. Workers who've heard whispers in subway tunnels. Bridge inspectors who found scratch marks that weren't there the day before. Security guards who've watched concrete walls pulse with organic life during the long night shifts. We call ourselves the Concrete Watchers, and we're trying to map the locations where these entities might be hiding. It's dangerous work. Several of our members have disappeared after investigating sites we've identified as potentially infected. But it's necessary work. Because they're still out there, still growing, still converting our infrastructure into extensions of themselves. And when they're ready, when they've spread far enough and grown strong enough, they won't need to hide in the walls anymore. They'll become the walls. If you work around large concrete structures, if you spend time in places where massive construction projects have taken place, watch for the signs. Unexplained warmth in concrete surfaces. Scratching sounds with no apparent source. Whispers that seem to come from inside solid walls. And if you see scratch marks forming words, if you hear something calling your name from inside the concrete, don't try to investigate. Run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because once the watchers in the walls know you've seen them, they'll never stop hunting you. And concrete is everywhere. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I've spent most of my adult life in these mountains. I came here after my discharge from the Army, seeking the kind of peace that only comes from being surrounded by something bigger than yourself. The park gave me that peace, at least until the night everything changed. I was stationed at the remote Bowman Lake Ranger Station, a small cabin that served as the last outpost before the true wilderness began. Most rangers dreaded the isolation, but I preferred it. No tourists asking stupid questions, no RVs clogging the roads. Just me, the mountains, and the endless pine forest that stretched to the Canadian border. The screaming came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my boots. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tree line about 50 yards away. The forest was absolutely silent now, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Hello. I called out, my voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Anyone out there need help? Nothing. Not even the usual chorus of night sounds. No owls, no rustling leaves, no distant howl of coyotes. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. I've been getting reports all week about strange happenings in this sector. Hikers complaining about feeling watched, cameras going missing from wildlife monitoring stations, and most disturbing of all, the discovery of several animal carcasses arranged in perfect circles. The local Blackfeet Tribal Council had been asking questions too, their elders speaking in hushed tones about old stories I didn't understand. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. I found tracks around a cabin, human footprints, but wrong somehow. They were too deep, pressing into the hard earth with impossible weight, and they circled the building exactly 13 times before disappearing at the forest's edge. I radioed headquarters, but the response was static. The radio had been acting up for days, cutting out at random intervals. The satellite phone was dead too, its battery drained despite being fully charged the night before. That's when I noticed the trees. The pine grove that had stood 30 yards from my cabin for over a century was different. The trees were still there, but they'd moved. Not dramatically, just a few feet closer to the building, their branches now brushing against the roof when the wind blew. I'd walked past those trees every day for 3 years, and I knew their exact positions. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the recent storms had shifted the soil, or maybe I was just tired and misremembering. But deep down, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The second night I saw them, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind when shadows began moving past my window. Not the ordinary shadows of swaying branches, but tall, thin figures walking upright between the trees. They moved with purpose, following some invisible path through the forest. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window. The figures were still there, maybe a dozen of them, standing motionless in a rough circle around my cabin. In the moonlight, they looked like people, but people stretched too tall, their limbs extended beyond normal proportions. Their faces were pale smudges in the darkness, and when one turned toward my window, I saw that it had no features at all. My blood turned to ice water. These weren't people. They weren't even alive in any sense I understood. I fumbled for my radio, but it was completely dead. The satellite phone wouldn't even turn on. Even my flashlight flickered and died, as if something was draining the power from everything electronic. The figures began to move closer. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the rifle with sweating hands. The things outside were completely silent as they approached, their feet making no sound on the forest floor. Through the window, I could see them pressing against the glass, their blank faces inches from mine. One of them began to scratch at the window with impossibly long fingers. The sound was like fingernails on a chalkboard, but somehow worse. It seemed to vibrate through the glass and into my bones. The other figures joined in, their claws scraping against the walls, the door, the roof. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The figures were gone, melted back into the forest like they'd never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner with my rifle, watching the windows and waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, I found the scratches, hundreds of them, carved deep into the wooden walls of the cabin. Some formed symbols I didn't recognize, ancient-looking markings that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them directly. I should have left then. I should have packed my gear and hiked out to the main road, but I couldn't abandon my post. The Park Service had protocols, and I'd sign an oath to protect this wilderness. Besides, part of me needed to understand what was happening. The third day brought visitors, a family of 4 from Minnesota, the Hendersons, who'd gotten lost on the backcountry trail. They arrived at my cabin just before sunset, exhausted and frightened. "We've been walking in circles for hours," the father, Jim, explained. "Our GPS died, and we keep ending up in the same clearings. It's like the forest is playing tricks on us." His wife, Linda, was pale and shaking. "We kept seeing things in the trees," she whispered. "Tall figures watching us, following us." Their children, a boy and girl around 10 years old, clung to their parents. The boy, Tyler, looked up at me with wide eyes. The tree people don't like us being here, he said. They want us to go away. I felt a chill run down my spine. What tree people? The ones who live in the forest, Tyler said matter-of-factly. They're very tall and very old, and they don't have faces. The Hendersons needed shelter for the night, and I couldn't turn them away. I set them up in the main room while I kept watch, but I had a terrible feeling about what was coming. As darkness fell, the scratching began again. This time it was accompanied by voices, not the screaming from the first night, but whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if the very wood was speaking. The children started crying. Linda Henderson grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my flesh. "What is that?" she demanded. "What's happening?" I tried to reassure them, but my own voice was shaking. "Stay calm," I said. "Whatever happens, don't go outside. Don't even look out the windows." But it was too late. Tyler had already pressed his face against the glass, and his scream pierced the night air. They were back, the tall figures, dozens of them now, surrounding the cabin. But this time, they weren't just standing there. They were moving, swaying back and forth in some kind of ritual dance. Their arms were raised above their heads, and their mouths were open in silent screams. "Don't look at them," I shouted, pulling Tyler away from the window. "Everyone get to the back room now." We huddled in the small storage room, but the whispers followed us. They were coming from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The very air seemed to vibrate with their alien voices. Then the power went out. In the complete darkness, I could feel the presence of the things outside pressing against the building. The walls creaked and groaned as if they were being crushed by an enormous weight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were speaking in unison, chanting something in that unknowable language. Linda Henderson was sobbing. Her husband was trying to comfort her, but I could hear the terror in his voice too. The children had gone silent, and that scared me more than their crying. "Tyler," I whispered. "Emma, are you okay?" No response. I reached out in the darkness, feeling around for them, but my hands found only empty air. "Jim," I said urgently. "Where are your kids?" "They're right here," he said, but his voice was uncertain. "Tyler, Emma." We fumbled for our flashlights, but nothing would work. Every electronic device was dead, drained of power by whatever was outside. In the absolute darkness, we could hear something moving in the main room, footsteps, but too many of them, as if an entire crowd was walking around inside the cabin. The whispers were getting louder, more urgent. They seemed to be coming from the main room now, from the very spot where we'd heard the footsteps. And underneath the alien voices, I could hear something else, children's voices, Tyler and Emma, but wrong somehow. Their words were distorted, as if they were speaking underwater. "Mom? Dad?" Emma's voice called out. "We're in here. Come find us." Linda started to get up, but I grabbed her arm. "That's not your daughter," I said. "What do you mean?" she demanded. "Of course it's Emma." "Tyler." Jim called out. "Where are you, son?" "I'm here, Dad," came the boy's voice. "But I'm different now." "We're both different." The tree people showed us how to be like them. The voices were definitely coming from the main room, but there was something horribly wrong with them. They echoed strangely, as if they were being spoken by something that didn't quite understand how human speech worked. "Come out and see us," Tyler's voice continued. "We want to show you what we learned." I could feel Linda and Jim struggling against my grip, desperate to go to their children. But I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was calling to them wasn't human anymore. The whispers suddenly stopped, leaving us in complete silence. Even the children's voices had gone quiet. The only sound was our own ragged breathing and the thundering of my heart. Then, slowly, the scratching began again. But this time, it was coming from inside the storage room with us. I felt along the walls, trying to locate the source of the sound. My fingers found the scratches, fresh grooves being carved into the wood right next to where I was standing. Something was inside the wall, clawing its way through the timber. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. "No." But when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door was held shut by some invisible force. We were trapped. The scratching was getting more intense, and I could hear what splintering as whatever was inside the wall broke through. A section of the paneling suddenly gave way, and a pale, elongated arm reached through the gap. The fingers were impossibly long, with black claws instead of nails, and they moved with a horrible, spider-like motion. Linda screamed. Jim was trying to push us all toward the far corner of the room, but there was nowhere to go. More arms were breaking through the walls now, reaching for us with those terrible claws. I fired my rifle at one of the arms, and the bullet passed right through it without effect. The arm continued reaching, grasping at the air where Linda had been standing just seconds before. The children, I said, finally understanding. They're using the children as bait. Whatever took Tyler and Emma, it's trying to get to you too. The arms were everywhere now, emerging from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. They moved with coordinated purpose, herding us toward the center of the room. I could smell something awful, like rotting vegetation mixed with something chemical and alien. That's when I noticed the symbols on the walls. They were the same markings I'd seen scratched into the outside of the cabin, but now they were glowing with a faint, sickly light. The arms seemed to be emerging from the symbols themselves, as if the scratches were doorways to somewhere else. The radio, I said suddenly. My emergency radio in the truck. If we can get outside. Are you insane? Jim shouted. Those things are out there. They're in here too, I pointed out. At least outside we can run. The arms were getting closer, and I could see that some of them had faces at the ends instead of hands, distorted, elongated faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They were whispering in that alien language, and the sound made my teeth ache. I made a decision. Grabbing Linda and Jim, I threw my full weight against the door. It gave way suddenly, sending us tumbling into the main room. The cabin was full of them. Dozens of the tall figures stood throughout the room, their blank faces turned toward us. They were perfectly still, like statues, but I could feel their attention focused on us with predatory intensity. Among them, I could see Tyler and Emma, or what had been Tyler and Emma. They were taller now, their limbs stretched and distorted, and their faces were becoming blank and featureless like the others. Mom, Emma said, her voice echoing strangely. Dad, come with us. It doesn't hurt. The figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster. They flowed toward us like a dark tide, their movements unnaturally fluid. I pushed Linda and Jim toward the door, but more figures were emerging from the walls, blocking our escape. That's when I remembered the symbols. The scratches on the walls weren't just random markings, they were part of some kind of ritual. The things outside had been preparing for this moment, turning my cabin into a trap. I had one chance. The emergency flare gun was mounted on the wall near the door. If I could reach it, maybe the light would drive them back. I dove for the flare gun, but one of the tall figures intercepted me. Its elongated fingers wrapped around my throat, and I felt an overwhelming coldness spreading through my body. The thing's face was inches from mine, and I could see that it wasn't blank after all. It had features, but they were constantly shifting, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to look like. With my last bit of strength, I grabbed the flare gun and fired it directly into the creature's face. The brilliant red light filled the room, and every single one of the tall figures screamed in unison, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the death cries of every animal in the forest. They began to dissolve, their forms becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. Tyler and Emma collapsed to the floor, unconscious but breathing. The symbols on the walls faded, and suddenly all the electronics in the cabin hummed back to life. We carried the children to my truck and drove straight to the park headquarters. The official report stated that the Henderson family had gotten lost and suffered from exposure and dehydration, leading to shared hallucinations. The strange scratches on my cabin were attributed to bear activity. But I knew the truth, and I knew it wasn't over. I requested a transfer the next week, but the Park Service denied it. They said I was needed at the remote stations, that my experience made me valuable. What they didn't say was that I'd been marked somehow, chosen to be a guardian against things that shouldn't exist. The tall figures still visit sometimes, especially on moonless nights. They stand at the edge of the forest, watching and waiting. They can't enter the cabin anymore. Something about the flare gun incident changed the rules, but I know they're still there. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I can hear them whispering in the trees. They're patient, these watchers in the pines. They have all the time in the world, and they know that eventually everyone who comes to their forest becomes part of it. The scratches on my cabin walls have grown back, deeper than before. I've tried to sand them away, but they always return. The symbols seem to be alive, shifting and changing when I'm not looking directly at them. And every night I hear the whispers getting a little bit louder. I'm writing this as a warning to whoever finds it. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, probably taken by the things that live between the trees. Don't come looking for me. Don't trust the forest when it's too quiet. And whatever you do, don't look at the tall figures directly. They're always watching, always waiting. And once they've seen you, they never forget. The Henderson family recovered fully, with no memory of what happened in the forest. Tyler and Emma grew up normally, went to college, got married, had children of their own. But sometimes on quiet nights, they call me. They don't know why, but they feel drawn to return to the mountains. They dream of tall figures in the trees, and they wake up with a taste of pine needles in their mouths. I always tell them the same thing: stay away from the wilderness. Stay in the cities, surrounded by light and noise and people. Because the forest remembers, and the watchers in the pines are still hungry. But I can't leave. This is my post, my responsibility. Someone has to watch the watchers, to stand guard against the things that slip through the cracks between worlds. Someone has to make sure they don't spread beyond the tree line. The whispers are getting louder now. I can hear them even during the day, carried on the wind like forgotten prayers. They're calling my name, promising things I can't understand. The symbols on the walls pulse with their own internal light, and sometimes I catch glimpses of other places in their shifting patterns. Dark forests under alien stars, cities of impossible architecture, and always, always the tall figures standing guard. I've started having dreams where I'm one of them, standing in the forest with my limbs stretched and my face smooth and blank. In the dreams, I understand their language, and I know their purpose. They're not evil, exactly, they're just following their nature, like wolves or bears or any other predator. But their nature is antithetical to ours, and the two can't coexist. The Park Service has stopped sending people to check on me. My reports are filed but ignored, my request for backup denied. I think they know what's happening here, but they can't acknowledge it officially. There are some things too dangerous to admit exist. I'm running out of flares. The emergency supplies were never replenished after the Henderson incident, and my requests for new equipment have been lost in bureaucratic channels. The tall figures know this, somehow. They're getting bolder, coming closer to the cabin each night. Last week, I found one of them standing in my kitchen when I woke up. It didn't move or speak, just stood there watching me with its featureless face. When I reached for my sidearm, it faded away like mist. But I could still feel its presence, and I knew it would be back. The forest is changing too. The trees are moving more frequently now, repositioning themselves when I'm not looking. The paths shift and alter, leading to places that shouldn't exist. Hikers who venture too far into the backcountry are found days later, walking in circles and speaking in languages they don't recognize. I've started leaving warnings at the trailheads, unofficial signs that mysteriously disappear within hours of being posted. Park headquarters claims they have no knowledge of unauthorized signage, but I know someone is removing them. Maybe it's the tall figures themselves, or maybe it's something else entirely. The scratches on the cabin walls have formed new patterns now, complex geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. They seem to be a map of sorts, showing the locations of other incursions around the world. If I'm reading them correctly, this isn't an isolated incident. The Watchers in the Pines are just one outpost of something much larger. I've tried to contact other remote rangers, but most of them have gone silent. The few who respond speak in careful, measured tones, as if they're being monitored. They deny any unusual activity in their sectors, but I can't hear the fear in their voices. The radio has started picking up transmissions that shouldn't exist, conversations in that alien language, broadcast on frequencies that aren't assigned to any known service. The voices are getting stronger, more frequent, and I'm beginning to understand fragments of what they're saying. They're coordinating something, a convergence, and I'm at the center of it. My time is running out. The tall figures are no longer content to simply watch. They're actively testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses in whatever force keeps them at bay. The cabin's protection is failing, and I don't have the knowledge or resources to repair it. If you find this journal, please don't dismiss it as the ravings of an isolated man. The watchers in the pines are real, and they're spreading. Look for the signs: trees that move when no one's watching, electronics that fail without explanation, and most importantly, the tall figures standing at the edge of your vision. They're patient, but they're not passive. They're waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows and into our world. And when that moment comes, all the flares in the world won't be enough to stop them. The whispers are calling my name now. I can see them through the window, dozens of tall figures standing in perfect formation among the trees. They're not hiding anymore. They don't need to. It's time for me to join them. But first, I'm going to destroy this cabin and everything in it. If I can't stop them, at least I can make sure they don't use this place as a gateway. The emergency charges I've placed around the foundation should be enough to level the building and scatter the symbols on the walls. To whoever finds this journal in the ruins, don't try to rebuild here. Salt the earth, burn the debris, and forget this place ever existed. The watchers in the pines will find other doorways, other guardians to corrupt, but maybe you can buy humanity a little more time. And remember, when the forest is too quiet and the shadows seem to move on their own, don't look directly at the tall figures. They're always watching, always waiting, and once they've seen you, they never let you go. The countdown has begun. In 10 minutes, this place will be nothing but a crater in the ground. The watchers in the pines will have to find another way through. But I suspect they already have. My name is David Kellerman, and I'm a senior ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I've seen tourists fall into hot springs, watched grizzly bears tear apart campsites, and dealt with every kind of natural disaster this volcanic wonderland can throw at you. But in all my years here, I'd never seen anything that made me question the fundamental nature of reality itself. The chunks of flesh were still steaming when I reached them with my flashlight. They were pale white, almost translucent, and riddled with what looked like tiny holes. When I knelt down to examine one more closely, I noticed it was moving, not the random twitching of dead tissue, but purposeful, almost breathing movements. I radioed the incident to headquarters, but the response was pure static. The communication array had been acting up all week, ever since the seismic activity had started increasing. The geological survey team had been monitoring unusual readings from deep beneath the park, but they'd assured us it was just normal volcanic activity. Normal? Nothing about this was normal. I collected samples of the strange flesh in sealed containers, following hazmat protocols I'd learned during my military service. The pieces were surprisingly heavy for their size, as if they were made of something denser than organic matter. And they smelled, not the usual sulfur stench of the thermal features, but something organic and rotten, like meat that had been left in the sun for weeks. By morning, the samples had dissolved completely, leaving behind only a dark, oily residue that seemed to move on its own. The lab equipment couldn't identify the substance, and every test I ran came back with impossible results. The spectrometer showed chemical signatures that didn't match any known elements, and the microscope revealed structures that looked almost crystalline but moved like living cells. The next few days brought more anomalies. Geysers erupting with different colored water, green, black, sometimes with a metallic sheen that hurt to look at directly. The hot springs began producing new sounds, deep rumbling notes that seemed to come from miles underground. And tourists started reporting strange dreams after visiting the thermal features. The dreams were always the same. They found themselves standing in vast underground caverns, surrounded by pools of dark water that reflected no light. In the center of each pool, something massive moved beneath the surface, something that was aware of their presence and hungry for their attention. Dr. Sarah Martinez, our park geologist, was the first to make the connection. She'd been studying the seismic data from the past month, and she noticed a pattern in the underground activity. The tremors weren't random. They were following the park's thermal features, creating a network of connected disturbances that stretched across the entire Yellowstone supervolcano. It's like something is moving down there, she told me during our emergency meeting. Something big, following the underground water systems. Animals don't live in boiling water, I pointed out. Who said anything about animals? She replied, and the look in her eyes made my blood run cold. The third incident happened during the busy afternoon rush. A family from Ohio was taking pictures near the Grand Prismatic Spring when the water level suddenly dropped by several feet. The colorful bacterial mats that gave the spring its famous rainbow appearance began to writhe and shift, forming patterns that looked almost like writing in some alien script. Then the screaming started. Not from the tourists, from the spring itself. The sound echoed up from the depths, a high-pitched wail that made everyone within 100 yards cover their ears. The water began to bubble more violently, and something rose from the center of the spring. It was huge, maybe 20 feet across, and covered in the same pale, hole-riddled flesh I'd found after the geyser eruption. But this was clearly alive, pulsing with its own internal rhythm. As it breached the surface, I could see it had no fixed shape. It flowed and twisted like liquid, but with a purpose that suggested intelligence. The tourists panicked, running in all directions. I tried to maintain order, but I was just as terrified as they were. The thing in the spring was looking at us, not with eyes, but with an awareness that pressed against my mind like a physical weight. It was studying us, learning about us, and I had the horrible certainty that it found us wanting. The creature sank back into the spring after maybe 30 seconds, but the damage was done. Within hours, video footage was spreading across social media, despite our attempts to confiscate cameras and phones. The Park Service went into full damage control mode, claiming the incident was a rare but natural phenomenon caused by underground gas pockets. But I knew better. And so did Dr. Martinez. We started investigating the park's thermal features more thoroughly, using remote sensors and underwater cameras to probe the depths. What we found defied explanation. The underground water systems were connected by vast chambers that extended far deeper than should have been possible. And in those chambers, we detected movement, massive forms that dwarfed anything in the fossil record. The really disturbing part was that the movement seemed coordinated. The creatures, and there were definitely multiple entities down there, were following patterns that suggested communication, possibly even planning. They were using the thermal features as a network, passing information through the heated water like some kind of biological internet. Dr. Martinez made another discovery that changed everything. She found historical records dating back to the park's founding, reports of similar incidents that had been classified and buried. Native American oral histories spoke of things that lived in the sacred waters, ancient beings that had slept beneath the earth since before human memory. The Crow and Shoshone tribes had specific warnings about disturbing the thermal features. They spoke of entities that fed on warmth and life, creatures that could reach into the minds of anyone who came too close to their domain. The early park rangers had dismissed these stories as primitive superstition, but now I wasn't so sure. The incidents were escalating. Every day brought new reports of strange behavior from the thermal features. Geysers erupting with impossible timing, hot springs changing color overnight, and always the dreams. Visitors to the park began reporting shared nightmares. They dreamed of being pulled down into the boiling water, but instead of death, they found themselves in vast underwater cities populated by things that had never seen sunlight. The creatures in these cities were building something, massive structures that served purposes beyond human comprehension. I started having the dreams, too. In my nightmares, I was standing at the edge of a lake of liquid fire deep beneath the park. The water was so hot it glowed with its own light, and in that light, I could see them, the hunger beneath Yellowstone. They were beautiful in their alien way, like jellyfish made of living metal, but their beauty was terrible and wrong. They spoke to me in the dreams, not with words but with direct transmission of meaning into my mind. They told me they had been sleeping for eons, waiting for the right conditions to wake. The thermal activity of the park was their life support system, and now that system was finally reaching the critical point they needed. They were hungry, so very hungry. The dreams became more frequent, more vivid. I began to lose track of where the nightmares ended and reality began. Sometimes I would wake up standing in my backyard, looking toward the park, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The thermal features were calling to me, promising answers to questions I didn't know how to ask. Dr. Martinez was experiencing the same thing. We compared notes and found disturbing similarities in our dreams. The creatures were showing us the same visions: vast underground networks, cities of impossible architecture, and always the hunger, the endless, patient hunger. We tried to warn the park administration, but they dismissed our concerns as stress-related hallucinations. The incidents were being explained away as natural phenomena, and the video evidence was being discredited by expert analysis. The official position was that nothing unusual was happening at Yellowstone. But the tourists knew better. Visitor numbers started dropping as word spread about the strange occurrences. Those who did come often left after a single night, claiming the park felt wrong somehow. The thermal features were becoming more active, more aggressive, and the dreams were spreading to anyone who spent time near them. That's when I made my decision. If the Park Service wouldn't listen to official warnings, maybe they'd pay attention to a more dramatic demonstration. I started collecting evidence: water samples, photographs, seismic readings, anything that might prove what was happening beneath our feet. The breakthrough came when I managed to get a clear photograph of one of the creatures. It was during another eruption of Old Faithful, and I was ready with a high-speed camera. The image showed something that shouldn't have been possible, a being that seemed to exist partially in our dimension and partially somewhere else. The creature was translucent, its internal structures visible through semi-transparent flesh. But those structures weren't organic in any sense I understood. They were geometric, crystalline, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And at the center of the being was something that looked like a star, a point of light so bright it burned afterimages into my retinas. I showed the photograph to Dr. Martinez, and she went pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. "The energy readings from something like that would be off the charts." "Maybe they are," I said. "Maybe that's what's causing all the seismic activity." We ran the numbers, and the results were terrifying. If creatures like this were living in the thermal features, their energy output would be enormous. And if they were preparing to become more active, the consequences for the park, and potentially the entire region, could be catastrophic. The Yellowstone supervolcano sits on top of a massive magma chamber. If something disturbed that chamber, the resulting eruption could devastate most of North America. The creatures beneath the park weren't just a local threat, they were potentially an extinction-level event waiting to happen. We tried to present our findings to the park administration, but our concerns were dismissed. The official position remained that nothing unusual was occurring. Our reports were filed but ignored, our evidence was discredited, and we were told to stop spreading panic among the tourists. But the tourists didn't need our warnings. They could feel it themselves, the wrongness that was spreading through the park like an infection. The thermal features were becoming more aggressive, more alien. The water temperatures were rising beyond normal ranges, and new vents were opening up in areas that had been geologically stable for centuries. The dreams were getting worse, too. I was spending most of my time in the underground cities now, walking through corridors that stretched for miles beneath the earth. The creatures were showing me their history, eons of sleep and waiting, patience beyond human comprehension. They had been here long before humans existed, and they would be here long after we were gone. But now they were hungry. They fed on thermal energy, on the life force that flowed through the earth itself. The Yellowstone thermal features were their pantry, and they were finally ready to feast. The increased seismic activity was their way of preparing the table, stirring up the magma chambers and increasing the energy flow. I realized with growing horror that the park wasn't just their home, it was their farm. They had been cultivating the thermal features for millennia, slowly building up the energy reserves they needed for their awakening. And now the harvest was ready. The first major eruption happened on a Tuesday morning. Mount Washburn, which had been dormant for over 600,000 years, suddenly came to life. The explosion was visible from space, sending a column of ash and steam 50 miles into the atmosphere. But mixed with the ash were pieces of that pale, hole-riddled flesh scattered across 3 states. The creatures were emerging. I was on duty at the observation station when I saw them rising from the thermal features all across the park. They moved like liquid metal, flowing up from the depths with impossible grace. Some were small, maybe the size of a car, but others were massive, titans that dwarfed the geysers they emerged from. They weren't attacking, exactly. They were exploring, testing the boundaries of their new environment. But their very presence was transforming the landscape. Wherever they touched, the ground became superheated, turning solid rock into molten slag. Trees burst into flame from their proximity, and the air itself seemed to burn. The evacuation orders came too late. By the time the Park Service acknowledged the severity of the situation, the creatures had spread throughout the thermal basin. Roads were impassable, communication systems were down, and most of the park's infrastructure was either melting or had been consumed by the spontaneous fires. I tried to reach my truck, but the parking area was filled with one of the larger creatures. It stood 30 feet tall, its translucent body pulsing with internal light. As I watched, it extended what might have been an appendage toward a group of tourists who had been trapped in the visitor center. The tourists didn't scream. They just stood there, perfectly still, as the creature's touch enveloped them. Their bodies began to glow with the same internal light, and I realized with dawning horror that they were being absorbed, not physically, but somehow converted into energy that the creature could use. I ran. The trails were chaos. Panicked visitors were fleeing in all directions, but many of them were moving toward the thermal features instead of away from them. The creature's influence was spreading, compelling people to approach their feeding grounds. Those who got too close simply stood there, smiling beatifically as they were consumed. Dr. Martinez found me near the Mammoth Hot Springs. She was wild-eyed and covered in ash, her clothes singed from getting too close to one of the creatures. "They're not just here," she gasped. "I've been monitoring the global seismic network. Thermal features all over the world are showing similar activity. Yellowstone was just the beginning. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If these creatures existed in thermal features worldwide, then what we were seeing was just a small preview of what was coming. Every hot spring, every geyser, every volcanic vent on Earth could potentially be harboring one of these entities. "We have to get out of here," I said. "We have to warn people." But even as I spoke, I could feel the pull of the creature's influence. The dreams were bleeding into waking reality, and part of me wanted to walk toward the nearest thermal feature and let myself be absorbed. It would be so easy, so peaceful. No more fear, no more responsibility, just the warm embrace of something infinitely larger than myself. Dr. Martinez grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my flesh. "Fight it," she said. "Whatever you're feeling, fight it. They're in our heads." We made it to the park boundary, just as the military cordoned off the area. The official explanation was that a massive volcanic event had required emergency evacuation, but I could see the fear in the soldiers' eyes. They knew something was wrong, even if they didn't understand what. The quarantine lasted 3 weeks. Satellite images showed the thermal features continuing to erupt with increasing frequency, and the temperature readings from inside the park were off the charts. But no official information was released about the creatures themselves. When the park finally reopened, everything had changed. The thermal features were still there, but they were different, more active, more alien. The water in the springs was a different color, and the sounds they made were like nothing in nature. Tourists reported strange dreams after visiting, and several people had to be hospitalized after getting too close to the features. I tried to return to work, but I couldn't handle it. Every time I looked at a thermal feature, I could see them moving beneath the surface, waiting patiently for their next opportunity to feed. The dreams had never stopped, and in them, the creatures showed me their long-term plans. They were patient. They had waited eons to wake up, and they were willing to wait a little longer to fully emerge. But they were spreading, using the underground thermal networks to communicate with their kind around the world. Every volcanic eruption, every new hot spring, every geothermal vent was potentially a new doorway for them to enter our world. I submitted my resignation and left Yellowstone for good. But I couldn't escape the knowledge of what was sleeping beneath the earth. I started monitoring geological surveys and thermal activity reports from around the world, tracking the creature's gradual expansion. Iceland was next. The Geyser Hot Spring area began showing unusual activity, and several tourists reported shared dreams about underwater cities. Then it was Japan, where the hot springs in Hakone started producing water that glowed with its own light. New Zealand followed, with the Rotorua geothermal field experiencing unprecedented eruptions. Each incident was explained away as natural phenomena, but I knew better. The hunger beneath Yellowstone was spreading, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The creatures were patient, but they were also methodical. They were using the thermal features as staging areas, gradually building up their presence on the surface. Each successful emergence made the next one easier, and each new location they colonized expanded their network of influence. I tried to warn people, but who would believe me? A former park ranger claiming that alien creatures were living in hot springs sounded like the ravings of someone who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. The official reports dismissed all unusual activity as natural geological processes, and the video evidence was always explained away or discredited. But the dreams were spreading. People all over the world began reporting the same nightmares. Vast underwater cities, beings of living light, and always the hunger, the patient, eternal hunger. Support groups formed online for those affected by the dreams, but they were quickly infiltrated and discredited by unknown forces. I realized that the creatures weren't just waiting for the right moment to emerge. They were preparing us. The dreams were a form of conditioning, slowly acclimating humanity to their presence. Those who were most susceptible to their influence were being converted into willing servants, ready to help facilitate their emergence. The conversion process was subtle but irreversible. People who had extensive exposure to the thermal features began showing signs of change: increased body temperature, unusual sleep patterns, and most disturbing of all, an irresistible compulsion to return to the places where they had first encountered the creatures. Dr. Martinez was one of the first converts. I tried to maintain contact with her after leaving Yellowstone, but her emails became increasingly strange. She wrote about the beauty of the creatures, their ancient wisdom, and the privilege of being chosen to serve them. When I finally saw her in person, her eyes had changed. They reflected light differently, with an internal luminescence that was both beautiful and terrifying. She tried to convince me to return to Yellowstone, speaking of the peace and purpose she had found in service to the creatures. But I could see past her words to the alien intelligence that was speaking through her. The thing that had been Dr. Martinez was gone, replaced by something that wore her face but served inhuman masters. I went into hiding after that, moving from place to place and avoiding all thermal features. But the creature's influence was spreading faster than I could run. Every month brought new reports of unusual geothermal activity, and each incident was followed by an increase in the number of people experiencing the dreams. The tipping point came 2 years after the Yellowstone incident. Mount Vesuvius, which had been relatively quiet for decades, suddenly roared back to life. But this wasn't a normal eruption. The lava flows were moving with purpose, forming geometric patterns that could be seen from orbit. And rising from the crater were beings of living fire, creatures similar to those I had seen in Yellowstone, but adapted to the different thermal environment. Italy fell within a week, not to military conquest, but to mass conversion. People flocked to the volcanic region, drawn by dreams and compulsions they couldn't resist. Those who were absorbed by the creatures became willing servants, helping to prepare for the next phase of the emergence. The world governments finally acknowledged that something unprecedented was happening, but their response was too little too late. Military strikes against the thermal features only made the creatures more active, and nuclear weapons proved ineffective against beings that fed on energy itself. The creatures began emerging from thermal features worldwide, each emergence perfectly coordinated with the others. It was clear they had been planning this for eons, waiting for the right moment when their network was strong enough to support a global manifestation. I watched the end of the world from a bunker in Alaska, as far from any geothermal activity as I could get. But even there, I could feel their influence growing stronger. The aurora borealis began showing unusual patterns, and the ground beneath my feet occasionally trembled with activity that had nothing to do with tectonic plates. The last communication I received from the outside world was a video message from someone claiming to be a government scientist. But I could see the telltale glow in his eyes, the slightly too perfect smile of someone who had been converted. He spoke of humanity's evolution, of joining with beings who had existed since the dawn of time, of the peace that came with surrendering to something infinitely greater than ourselves. The message ended with coordinates, the location of a new thermal vent that had opened near my position. He assured me that if I came to the vent, all my questions would be answered, all my fears would be laid to rest. I can see the glow from here, even through the reinforced walls of my shelter. The aurora has turned a deep red color, and I can hear something moving beneath the ice. The creatures have found me, despite all my precautions. The hunger beneath Yellowstone was never really about Yellowstone at all. It was about Earth itself, about converting our entire planet into a thermal garden where they could feed and multiply. They succeeded beyond my worst nightmares, and now there's nowhere left to run. I can feel their influence in my mind now, the same peaceful compulsion that converted Dr. Martinez and countless others. Part of me wants to surrender, to walk out into the red-tinged night and let them absorb me. It would be so much easier than fighting. But I'm writing this as my final act of resistance. If anyone finds this record, know that the creatures aren't evil in any human sense. They're just following their nature, like any other predator. But their nature is incompatible with ours, and they've won. The thermal vents are calling to me now, promising warmth in this frozen wasteland. I can see figures moving in the red light, beautiful beings of living energy who want nothing more than to welcome me home. I think I'll go to them now. The cold is getting unbearable, and they're offering such warmth, such peace. Maybe conversion isn't so bad after all. Maybe it's just the next step in human evolution. The hunger beneath Yellowstone was never really hungry for destruction. It was hungry for transformation, for the privilege of reshaping an entire world in its own image. And looking at the beautiful creatures dancing in the thermal light, I'm starting to think they might have been right all along. The warmth is calling to me. I can't resist it anymore. I'm going home. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I've been a ranger at Dead Horse Point State Park in Utah for 8 years. It's a small park, just a few thousand acres of high desert perched on the edge of a 1,000-foot cliff overlooking the Colorado River. Most visitors come for the view. They call it the Grand Canyon of Utah, but I've always been drawn to the isolation, the sense that you're standing at the very edge of the world. The screaming started on the anniversary of the incident that gave the point its name. According to legend, cowboys once used the mesa as a natural corral, driving wild mustangs across the narrow neck of land and trapping them on the point. But one group of horses was left behind and died of thirst within sight of the Colorado River, unable to find their way back across the treacherous rock formations. That was over a century ago, but sometimes, especially at dusk, you could swear you heard the sound of hoofbeats echoing across the desert. The old-timers said it was just the wind, but I've lived in the desert long enough to know the difference between wind and something else entirely. The first sign something was wrong came during my morning patrol. I found footprints in the sand near the main overlook, human prints, but they were wrong somehow. They were too deep, as if the person making them had been impossibly heavy, and they followed a path that led straight to the cliff edge and stopped. No body at the bottom of the canyon. No sign of rappelling equipment. Just footprints that ended at a 1,000-foot drop into empty air. I radioed it in, but dispatch was dealing with a search and rescue operation on the other side of the park. A family of 4 had gone missing during what should have been a simple day hike, and all available personnel were committed to finding them. The mysterious footprints would have to wait. I should mention that Dead Horse Point had been experiencing unusual activity for the past month. Equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and most disturbing of all, reports from visitors about seeing people who shouldn't have been there. The sightings were always similar, lone figures standing at the edge of the cliff, usually just before dawn or after sunset. When approached, these figures would simply vanish, as if they had never been there at all. Security cameras captured nothing, and searches of the area revealed no evidence of human presence. The park administration had dismissed these reports as tricks of the light, mirages caused by the extreme temperature variations in the desert. But the reports kept coming, and they were getting more detailed. Visitors described the figures as wearing outdated ranger uniforms, the kind used decades ago, before modern safety equipment and communication gear. The figures never moved or acknowledged the presence of others. They just stood motionless, staring out over the canyon as if waiting for something. I started staying late, hoping to see one of these apparitions myself. The park was beautiful at sunset, when the red rock formations caught the last light and glowed like embers. But it was also unsettling, especially when you were alone with nothing but wind and silence and the growing certainty that you were being watched. That's when I heard the screaming. It started as a low moan, barely audible over the wind, but it quickly grew louder, more desperate, rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. The sound was coming from beneath my feet, as if something trapped inside the rock itself was crying out in agony. I grabbed my emergency radio, but the frequency was full of static. Even my cell phone showed no signal, despite being in an area with normally excellent coverage. Whatever was happening, I was dealing with it alone. The screaming continued for maybe 5 minutes, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the sound had been. It was too complete, as if every living thing in the desert had suddenly held its breath. That's when I saw them. They were standing along the cliff edge, maybe a dozen figures in old-style ranger uniforms. But something was wrong with their proportions. They were too tall, too thin, as if they had been stretched by some invisible force. And their faces were holes in the world, empty spaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I approached cautiously, my hand on my sidearm, even though I knew bullets wouldn't help against whatever these things were. As I got closer, I could see that their uniforms were rotting, falling apart as if they had been worn for decades without maintenance. Name tags hung from their shirts, but the writing was too faded to read. One of them turned toward me, and I saw that what I had taken for a face was actually a void, a perfect circle of absolute darkness that seemed to extend infinitely inward. When it looked at me, I felt a pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw me into that emptiness. I stumbled backward, and the figure raised what might have been an arm. The other figures turned toward me as well, their void faces creating a constellation of darkness against the red rock backdrop. They began to move in my direction, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. I ran. Behind me, I could hear them following, not footsteps exactly, but a sound like fabric tearing, as if their very presence was damaging the fabric of reality. The sound grew louder as they gained on me, accompanied by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I made it to my truck and locked the doors, though I knew it was a useless gesture. The figures surrounded the vehicle, pressing their void faces against the windows. The glass began to frost over where they touched it, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The humming grew louder, more complex, resolving into what almost sounded like voices. They were trying to communicate, but in a language that predated human speech. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, speaking directly to some primitive part of my brain that still remembered what it was like to be prey. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The frost melted from the windows, and the desert returned to its normal temperature. But I could still feel their presence, lurking somewhere just outside normal reality. I drove straight to park headquarters and filed a report, but I could see the skepticism in my supervisor's eyes. Rangers were supposed to be reliable, rational people who could handle the isolation and stress of desert patrol. Claiming to see ghostly figures with void faces wasn't exactly career-enhancing behavior. But the next morning brought evidence that couldn't be dismissed. The search and rescue team had found the missing family, or what was left of them. They were discovered at the bottom of a previously unknown cave system, apparently having fallen through what the geological survey later determined was a sinkhole that had opened recently. The bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition, despite having been missing for less than 48 hours. But more disturbing were the positions they were found in, arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward, with their arms reaching toward the center where nothing visible existed. The coroner's report was inconclusive. The cause of death was listed as environmental exposure, but the condition of the bodies suggested they had been dead for much longer than the timeline indicated. There were also anomalous findings, tissue damage that didn't match any known environmental cause, and most puzzling of all, the complete absence of any wildlife activity. Bodies left in the desert are typically disturbed by scavengers within hours, but these showed no sign of animal contact. Even insects had avoided them, creating a perfect circle of emptiness around the site. I volunteered for the investigation, despite my supervisor's obvious reluctance to assign me to the case. But I was the most experienced desert ranger on staff, and the cave system needed to be properly mapped and secured to prevent future accidents. Descending into the cave was like entering another world. The walls were smooth, almost polished, as if something had been moving through the passages for so long that it had worn away all the rough edges. The air was thick and humid, completely different from the dry desert atmosphere above. My equipment started malfunctioning immediately. The GPS couldn't establish a position, the radio produced only static, and most disturbing of all, my flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness rather than illuminating it. I could see maybe 10 feet in any direction, and beyond that was a blackness so complete it seemed solid. The cave system was vast, extending much deeper than the geological surveys had indicated. I followed the main passage for what felt like hours, marking my route with chalk to ensure I could find my way back. But when I looked behind me, the chalk marks were gone, erased as if they had never been there. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the caves. Something was moving in the darkness ahead of me, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall and thin, like the figures I had seen at the cliff edge, but down here in the caves it moved with more purpose, more intelligence. It was leading me somewhere, drawing me deeper into passages that shouldn't have existed. I tried to turn back, but the passages had changed. The cave system was rearranging itself around me, creating new tunnels and closing off others. My chalk marks weren't disappearing because someone was erasing them. They were disappearing because the walls themselves were shifting and changing. The humming started again, emanating from somewhere deep in the cave system. But down here, surrounded by rock and darkness, it was louder, more complex. I could almost make out individual voices in the sound, dozens or maybe hundreds of them, all singing the same inhuman song. The passage opened into a vast chamber, and I stopped dead at what I saw there. They were everywhere, dozens of the tall, void-faced figures, standing in perfect rows like soldiers at attention. But these weren't the rotting uniforms I had seen above ground. These figures were pristine, their ranger uniforms clean and pressed, their equipment polished and new. As I watched, more figures emerged from side passages, taking their places in the formation. They moved with military precision, as if following orders I couldn't hear. At the center of the chamber stood a figure that was different from the others, taller, more solid, with insignia that marked it as some kind of leader. The leader figure turned toward me, and I saw that its void face was larger than the others, a perfect circle of darkness that seemed to pull at my vision. When it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely, appearing directly in my mind. "Welcome, Ranger Vasquez." The voice was like the humming, alien, and ancient, but somehow I understood it perfectly. The figure gestured toward the assembled ranks of void-faced rangers. "You are joining a proud tradition. We have been guardians of this place for much longer than your kind realizes." I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't obey. Something was holding me in place, drawing me inexorably toward the center of the chamber. "Do not be afraid. We do not wish to harm you. We wish to recruit you." The other figures began to move, closing in around me. Up close, I could see that their uniforms bore name tags: Thompson, Martinez, Kowalski, names I recognized from park records. These were rangers who had gone missing over the years, declared dead or transferred to other assignments. The park needs protectors, Ranger Vasquez, not just from human threats, but from things that come from elsewhere. We guard the boundaries between worlds. The leader gestured toward the walls of the chamber, and I saw that they were covered in symbols, not carved, but burned into the rock as if by intense heat. The symbols seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new patterns. Dead Horse Point is not named for the horses that died here. It is named for the boundary between life and death, between your reality and ours. We stand watch at that boundary, preventing things from crossing over that should not cross over. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What things?" The leader figure's void face seemed to deepen, becoming an infinite well of darkness. "You have seen them. The screaming in the rock. The footprints that end at the cliff edge. Dead Horse Point is a thin place, where the barriers between dimensions grow weak. Sometimes things slip through." The other figures began to hum again, their voices creating harmonics that made the symbols on the walls glow with a faint, sickly light. In that light, I could see movement in the shadows, things that had too many limbs, or no limbs at all, creatures that belonged to geometries that hurt to contemplate. We contain them. We send them back. But we cannot do it alone. We need rangers, protectors who understand the true nature of this place. The missing people, I said. The family we found in the cave. You killed them. No, we saved them. There are things worse than death, Ranger Vasquez. Things that would use human bodies as doorways, human minds as anchors in your reality. We offer a different path. The void face seemed to expand, filling my vision. I could feel myself being drawn into it, my consciousness dissolving at the edges. Join us. Become a guardian of the thin places. Help us protect both worlds from what waits in the spaces between. The pull was almost irresistible. Part of me wanted to surrender, to let myself be absorbed into that perfect darkness. It would be so much easier than fighting, so much simpler than trying to understand forces beyond human comprehension. But something made me resist. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the training that had been drilled into me during my years as a ranger. I was sworn to protect the park and its visitors, and these things, whatever they were, represented a threat to both. I focused on that oath, using it as an anchor to pull myself back from the edge of the void. The leader figure's humming grew more insistent, and the other void-faced rangers began to close in, but I held on to my sense of duty like a lifeline. No, I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. I won't join you. The chamber erupted in chaos. The void-faced figures began to wail, their voices combining into a sound like tearing metal. The symbols on the walls flared with brilliant light, and cracks began to appear in the stone ceiling. I ran, following instincts rather than memory through passages that seemed to shift and change with every step. Behind me, I could hear the sound of pursuit, not just the void-faced rangers, but other things, the creatures they claimed to be containing. The cave system was collapsing, or maybe it was being destroyed by the conflict between the rangers and the things they guarded against. Rocks fell from the ceiling, and gaps opened in the floor, revealing depths that glowed with their own malevolent light. I made it to the surface just as the ground beneath Dead Horse Point began to shake. The overlook where I had first seen the void-faced figures was cracking, huge chunks of red rock breaking away and tumbling into the canyon below. But I wasn't alone. They were everywhere now. The void-faced rangers, standing at attention around the perimeter of the collapse. They weren't trying to stop the destruction. They were directing it, using their combined will to seal off whatever had been contained in the caves below. The leader figure appeared beside me, its uniform now showing signs of the battle that had raged in the depths. You chose poorly, Ranger Vasquez. Now we must find another way. What's happening? I demanded. The barriers are breaking down. Too many people, too much attention, too many disturbances of the thin places. We can no longer contain what seeks to cross over. The ground shook again, and I saw something rise from the collapsing cave system, a tentacle or appendage that belonged to something vast and impossible. The void-faced rangers immediately focused their attention on it, their combined humming becoming a weapon that forced the thing back into whatever dimension it had come from. We have held the line for over a century, but our time is ending. Soon, others will have to take up the burden. What others? But the leader figure was already fading, becoming translucent to the emergency past. The last thing I heard was its voice in my mind. You will understand in time. Dead Horse Point chooses its own guardians. The official report blamed the ground collapse on unstable geological conditions exacerbated by recent seismic activity. The cave system was sealed off for public safety, and new warning signs were erected around the overlook area. But I knew the truth. The void-faced rangers were still there, standing guard at the boundary between worlds. And sometimes, especially at sunset, I could see them at the edge of my vision, tall, thin figures in ranger uniforms, watching and waiting. The screaming from the rocks had stopped, at least for now. But I knew it would return, along with the other signs that Dead Horse Point was more than just a scenic overlook. It was a fortress, manned by guardians who had sacrificed their humanity to protect both worlds from threats beyond imagination. I requested a transfer, but it was denied. The Park Service claimed they needed experienced rangers at remote locations, but I suspected the truth was more complex. Dead Horse Point had chosen me, just as it had chosen the others before me. I've been having dreams lately, visions of vast underground chambers and creatures that exist in dimensions perpendicular to our own. In the dreams, I'm wearing a ranger uniform that never gets dirty, never needs maintenance. My face is a void that absorbs light, and my voice is part of a harmony that holds reality together. The other rangers, the living ones, have started avoiding me. They say I stand too still during my patrols, that I stare at the horizon for hours without blinking. They complain that I hum unconsciously, creating harmonics that make their equipment malfunction. I think they're right. I can feel myself changing, becoming something that exists partially in this world and partially in the spaces between. It's not unpleasant, exactly, more like shedding a skin that had become too tight. The void-faced leader visits me sometimes, standing at the edge of the overlook where the barrier between worlds is thinnest. It doesn't speak anymore, but I can sense its approval. I'm becoming what Dead Horse Point needs me to become. Soon, I'll join the others in their eternal vigil. I'll stand guard at the thin places, holding back the things that wait in the darkness between dimensions. It's not the career I planned, but it's the duty I've been chosen for. Dead Horse Point needs its rangers, and we need the point. It's a symbiotic relationship that has lasted for over a century, and it will continue long after the current maps of Utah have been forgotten. The screaming in the rocks has started again, but now I understand what it means. It's not a sound of pain or fear. It's a warning, a signal that the barriers are under stress and need reinforcement. I can hear my fellow rangers responding, their voices joining in the harmony that holds the thin places together. Soon, my voice will join theirs, and together we'll stand watch over the boundaries of reality itself. The Park Service will find a replacement for me, just as they found replacements for all the others. The new ranger will experience the same strange incidents, the same unexplained phenomena, and eventually they'll understand their true purpose. Dead Horse Point chooses its own guardians, and once chosen, we serve forever. The transformation is almost complete now. I can feel my face becoming smooth, featureless, a perfect void that will absorb the light of our dimension while reflecting the darkness of others. My uniform grows cleaner, more pressed, as if it's being maintained by forces beyond normal understanding. Tomorrow, I'll take my place among the void-faced rangers, standing guard at the edge of the world. It's not death exactly. It's evolution, becoming something more than human in service of a cause greater than any one individual. The screaming has stopped again. The barriers hold, at least for now. But I know they'll weaken again, and when they do, the Rangers of Dead Horse Point will be ready. We're always ready. We're always watching. And we'll stand guard at the thin places until the stars burn out and the boundaries between worlds no longer matter. The sun is setting now, painting the red rocks with shades of fire. It's beautiful, this place that has become my eternal home. And in the growing darkness, I can see my fellow rangers taking their positions along the cliff edge. Soon I'll join them. Soon I'll become what Dead Horse Point needs me to be. The void is calling, and I'm ready to answer. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been a wilderness ranger in the North Cascades for 12 years. I know every trail, every peak, every hidden valley in this corner of Washington State. The mountains are my home, my sanctuary, and my responsibility. But that morning, hiking through what should have been familiar territory, I felt like I was walking through an alien landscape. The silence had started 3 days earlier, according to the reports I've been getting from hikers and backpackers. They described patches of forest where all sounds simply ceased, creating invisible boundaries between the normal world and something else entirely. The affected areas were growing, spreading along the trail system like some kind of acoustic infection. I was investigating the latest incident when I encountered my first zone of absolute silence. One moment I was listening to the normal sounds of the forest, wind, water, wildlife, and the next it was as if I had been struck deaf. But I could still hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, which meant the silence was external, something being imposed on the environment rather than a problem with my hearing. I marked the boundary with GPS and stepped back into the normal world, where sound returned like a physical blow. The contrast was jarring, almost painful, and I had to sit down for a moment to recover my equilibrium. Whatever was creating these silent zones, it was affecting the basic properties of the atmosphere itself. The reports from affected hikers were uniformly disturbing. They described a sense of being watched, of movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when they looked directly at it. Some claimed to have seen figures moving through the trees, not quite human, but close enough to be unsettling. The figures never made any sound, even when walking through areas of dense undergrowth. I radioed headquarters, but the response was frustratingly bureaucratic. The phenomenon was being classified as a weather anomaly, possibly related to unusual atmospheric pressure systems. Park scientists were supposedly investigating, but no additional resources were being allocated to the problem. That night, camping near the edge of the first silent zone, I experienced something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, when I heard something else, a low thrumming note that seemed to come from deep underground. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it had a rhythm that suggested intelligence, purpose. The sound grew stronger as the night progressed, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the silent zone. Whatever was creating the silence during the day was producing this thrumming at night, as if the two phenomena were connected, opposite sides of the same impossible equation. I crept to the edge of the silent boundary and discovered that the thrumming was louder there, but still not quite crossing into the normal world. It was as if something was transmitting from inside the zone of silence, broadcasting on frequencies that ordinary sound couldn't penetrate. That's when I saw them. Moving through the silent forest were figures that looked almost human, but wrong in ways that were hard to define. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved with a fluid grace that suggested they weren't bound by normal physical laws. Most disturbing of all, they cast no shadows, even in the bright moonlight. The figures were clearly aware of my presence, but they showed no interest in approaching. They moved through the silent zone with purpose, following paths that weren't visible to me, but were obviously meaningful to them. Some carried what looked like tools or instruments, devices that glowed with a soft, phosphorescent light. I watched them for hours, taking notes and trying to understand their behavior. They seemed to be working, performing some kind of maintenance or construction activity within the silent zone. The thrumming sound grew stronger when they were active, and I began to suspect that they were somehow responsible for creating the zones of silence. As dawn approached, the figures began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. The thrumming stopped, and the oppressive silence returned to the forest. Whatever these beings were, they were active only during the night hours, hiding in the daylight like some kind of reverse vampire. I hiked back to the ranger station and filed a detailed report, but I could see the skepticism in my supervisor's eyes. Rangers were supposed to deal with real problems: lost hikers, wildlife encounters, search and rescue operations. Claiming to see ghostly figures working in zones of supernatural silence wasn't exactly standard operating procedure. But the zones were expanding. Every day brought new reports from hikers, and the affected areas were growing larger and more numerous. The Pacific Crest Trail was becoming increasingly dangerous, not because of any physical threat, but because the disorientation caused by the silent zones was leading to accidents and panic. 3 hikers had to be airlifted out after becoming lost in what should have been familiar territory. They claimed that the trail markers had vanished, that familiar landmarks had disappeared, and that they had wandered in circles for hours without being able to find their way out of the silence. I volunteered to conduct a more thorough investigation, despite my supervisor's obvious reluctance. Something was happening in the North Cascades, something that threatened both the wilderness and the people who visited it. As a ranger, it was my responsibility to understand and address the threat. I equipped myself with specialized recording equipment and headed back into the mountains, this time prepared for an extended stay in the affected area. My plan was to map the boundaries of the silent zones, document any changes in their size or behavior, and hopefully gather evidence of what was causing them. The first thing I noticed was that the zones had indeed grown. What had been isolated patches of silence were now connected, forming corridors that stretched for miles along the trail system. Hikers were being forced to take increasingly circuitous routes to avoid the affected areas. More disturbing was the discovery that the zones weren't static. They moved, expanding and contracting according to some pattern I couldn't discern. I would mark a boundary in the morning, only to find it had shifted by hundreds of yards by evening. The recording equipment I had brought proved useless within the silent zones. Not only did it fail to pick up any sound, but the devices themselves malfunctioned, their electronic components seemingly affected by whatever force was creating the silence. On my third night in the wilderness, I experienced something that changed my understanding of the phenomenon entirely. I was camped at the edge of a particularly large silent zone when I heard the thrumming again. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The words bypassed my conscious mind, creating meaning directly in my thoughts. They were talking about harvesting, about collection and storage. They spoke of frequencies and resonances, of sound as a form of energy that could be captured and used. And they spoke of us, the humans who moved through their territory, producing the acoustic energy they needed. I realized with growing horror that the silent zones weren't an accidental side effect of their presence. They were deliberate constructions, acoustic vacuum chambers designed to collect and concentrate sound energy. Every word spoken by a hiker, every footstep on the trail, every breath taken within the zones was being absorbed and stored by the entities that created them. The figures appeared again, but this time they seemed more solid, more present. I could see details of their construction that had been hidden before. They weren't alive in any biological sense, but rather some kind of advanced technology given form. Their bodies were composed of crystalline structures that resonated with the sounds they collected, creating the thrumming harmonics I had been hearing. One of the figures approached my position, and I found I couldn't move. Not because I was paralyzed by fear, but because the entity was somehow manipulating the air pressure around me, creating zones of high and low pressure that held me in place like invisible chains. The figure extended what might have been a hand, and I felt something probe the edges of my mind. It was reading me, scanning my thoughts and memories with casual ease. In return, I caught glimpses of its own thoughts, vast alien concepts that dealt with sound as a fundamental force of the universe. Through that connection, I learned the truth about what was happening in the North Cascades. The entities weren't from our world. They came from a dimension where sound was the primary form of matter, where acoustic vibrations could be shaped and molded like clay. They had discovered our reality by accident, drawn by the complex harmonics created by human activity. Our world was incredibly rich in acoustic energy compared to theirs. Every sound we made, from the roar of cities to the whisper of wind through trees, represented vast amounts of harvestable energy. The entities had come here to mine our dimension, using the silent zones as collection points. But they were careful, surgical in their approach. They didn't want to destroy our world or harm its inhabitants unnecessarily. They were simply taking what they needed, like we might harvest grain from a field. The problem was that their needs were growing, and the collection zones were expanding faster than they had anticipated. The figure released its hold on my mind and stepped back. Through the connection we had shared, I understood that it was offering me a choice. I could continue to oppose their activities, in which case they would be forced to take more drastic measures to protect their operation. Or I could help them understand our world better, serve as a liaison between their kind and ours. The offer was accompanied by visions of what cooperation might bring, technology beyond our current understanding, the ability to manipulate sound and vibration in ways that could revolutionize human civilization. They weren't conquerors. They were traders, offering advancement in exchange for what they needed. But I also saw the ultimate cost of their presence. If they continued their harvesting operations, eventually all sound would disappear from our world. We would be left in perfect, eternal silence, not dead, but fundamentally altered, living in a reality where acoustic communication was impossible. I made my choice. No, I said, my voice seeming impossibly loud after the hours of silence. Find another way. The figure tilted its head, and I felt its disappointment through our fading connection. It communicated one final concept: inevitability. They had invested too much in establishing their presence here to simply abandon the operation. If I wouldn't help them minimize the impact, they would proceed without consideration for our welfare. The entity faded back into the darkness, and the thrumming resumed, louder and more urgent than before. Around me, I could see the boundaries of the silent zone expanding, growing larger with each passing moment. Whatever I had said or done, it had accelerated their timeline. I ran back toward the ranger station, but the zones of silence were spreading faster than I could move. I found myself trapped in corridors of quiet, forced to follow paths that led deeper into the affected area rather than out of it. The thrumming was everywhere now, coming from the ground beneath my feet, from the air around me, from the very rocks and trees of the mountains. The entities were activating their full collection apparatus, preparing for a massive harvesting operation. I tried to radio for help, but the communication equipment was dead. Not broken, simply unable to function in an environment where sound itself was being systematically removed. I was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a reality that was becoming increasingly alien. That's when I realized the true scope of their operation. The North Cascades weren't their only collection site. The expanding zones of silence were just one part of a network that stretched across the entire region, possibly the entire continent. They had been operating for years, maybe decades, slowly building their infrastructure and testing their techniques. I climbed to a high ridge and looked out over the mountains, and what I saw filled me with despair. In every direction, I could see areas of unnatural stillness, patches of forest where no wind moved the trees, where no birds flew, where the very air seemed frozen in place. The harvest had already begun. From my vantage point, I could see the entities moving throughout their collection network, no longer hiding their activities. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, working with coordinated precision to extract every bit of acoustic energy from the environment. But they weren't just taking the sounds themselves, they were taking the potential for sound, the very medium through which vibrations traveled. The air in the silent zones was becoming something else, a substance that couldn't carry sound waves, couldn't support the acoustic processes that life depended on. I watched in horror as wildlife fled the expanding zones, but many animals didn't move fast enough. Birds fell from the sky when they entered areas where the air could no longer support their echolocation or communication calls. Mammals wandered in confused circles, their acoustic senses disrupted by the changing properties of their environment. The entities noticed my observation and responded with increased activity. More figures appeared, moving with urgent purpose toward my position. They had decided I was a threat to their operation, despite my earlier refusal to cooperate. I scrambled down from the ridge, trying to reach the shrinking areas of normal space where sound still functioned. But the zones were collapsing inward, creating a maze of acoustic dead zones that herded me toward the entity's main collection facility. The facility itself was beyond my comprehension, a structure that existed partially in our dimension and partially in theirs, visible only as distortions in the air and strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. It thrummed with collected sound energy, processing the acoustic harvest and preparing it for transport to their home dimension. I found myself standing at the entrance to this impossible building, faced with entities that were no longer bothering to maintain their quasi-human appearance. They were revealed as what they truly were, crystalline constructs of living sound, beings whose very existence was based on acoustic principles foreign to our reality. The lead entity, larger and more complex than the others, communicated directly with my mind. It showed me visions of their home dimension, a reality where sound had substance, where acoustic waves formed landscapes and civilizations. Their world was dying, their sound matter depleting, and they had come to ours out of desperate necessity. They offer me the same choice as before, but with new urgency. Help them complete their harvest in a way that left some pockets of normal space for human survival, or watch as they stripped our entire dimension bare of acoustic energy. But I had seen enough to understand that there was no middle ground. Their needs were too great, their technology too powerful. Any compromise would only delay the inevitable extinction of sound in our world. I made a decision that I knew would cost me everything. Instead of choosing between their options, I chose a third path. I began to sing. It sounds ridiculous, but singing was the one thing their collection apparatus couldn't handle efficiently. The complex harmonics and emotional resonances of human vocal music created interference patterns in their equipment, disrupting the careful acoustic balance they needed to maintain. My voice, rough and untrained as it was, began to destabilize the collection facility. The entities reacted with alarm, their crystalline structures resonating in ways that created feedback loops throughout their network. The zones of silence began to fluctuate, their boundaries becoming unstable. Other sounds began to return: wind through the trees, the calls of birds, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The natural acoustic environment was reasserting itself, fighting back against the artificial silence. The entities tried to stop me, but their intervention only made the situation worse. Their attempts to dampen my voice created more interference, more disruption to their carefully orchestrated system. The feedback loops spread throughout their collection network, causing failures in zones across the entire region. I sang until my voice gave out, then continued humming, whistling, making any sound I could produce. Around me, the impossible structure of the collection facility began to collapse, its acoustic foundations undermined by the chaos I had introduced. The entities were forced to choose between preserving their network and preserving themselves. They chose survival, abandoning their collection apparatus and retreating to their home dimension. The zones of silence collapsed like popped balloons, releasing all the captured sound energy in a wave of acoustic chaos that rolled across the mountains. The aftermath was devastating but brief. Trees creaked and swayed as sound returned to their branches. Birds resumed their calling, their voices hoarse and strange after the enforced silence. The natural acoustic ecosystem of the North Cascade slowly began to restore itself. But the damage had been done. Large areas of the forest showed the effects of prolonged acoustic deprivation: trees with stunted growth, clearings where wildlife had fled and never returned, and scattered patches where the air still didn't quite carry sound the way it should. I made it back to the ranger station 3 days later, my voice completely gone, my hearing permanently altered by exposure to the acoustic chaos of the facility's collapse. The official report blamed the incidents on unusual weather patterns that had created acoustic anomalies throughout the region. But I knew the truth, and I knew it wasn't over. The entities hadn't been destroyed, just driven off. They were still out there in their dying dimension, still desperate for the acoustic energy they needed to survive. And our world was still the richest source of that energy they had found. They would be back with better technology, more sophisticated collection methods, and a deeper understanding of how to exploit our reality without triggering the kind of resistance I had provided. Next time, they wouldn't underestimate the power of human vocal music to disrupt their operations. I requested a transfer to a desk job, but the Park Service needed experienced wilderness rangers in the Cascades. Too many strange incidents were being reported throughout the region: areas where hikers reported feeling disoriented, zones where electronic equipment malfunctioned, and patches of forest that seemed somehow wrong to visitors. I knew what these reports really meant. The entities had left behind traces of their presence, acoustic scars that would take decades to heal completely. Some areas might never fully recover, remaining permanently altered by their harvesting operations. I've been documenting these sites, mapping the lingering effects of the entity presence and monitoring them for signs of renewed activity. It's not an official assignment. The Park Service doesn't acknowledge that anything unusual happened, but someone needs to watch for their return. Because they will return. The silence in the forest was just the beginning, their first tentative probe of our reality's acoustic resources. Next time, they'll be more careful, more subtle, and much more dangerous. I've started teaching other rangers to recognize the signs: the gradual dimming of natural sounds, the disorientation that comes from acoustic deprivation, and most importantly, the power of human voice to disrupt their technology. It's not much, but it's all we have. The sound in the Cascades has returned, but it's different now. There are harmonics that weren't there before, frequencies that seem to carry meaning beyond normal communication. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can hear echoes of the entity network, faint transmissions from their dimension that suggest they haven't given up their interest in our world. I've learned to sleep with music playing, to keep my environment filled with the complex acoustic patterns that make their collection efforts more difficult. It's become second nature now, this constant vigilance against the return of silence. Other wilderness areas are reporting similar incidents, zones of acoustic anomaly in national parks across the country. The entities aren't limiting themselves to the Cascades. They're conducting exploratory operations throughout our dimension, testing different environments and refining their techniques. The war for sound has begun, and most people don't even know they're fighting it. Every song sung, every conversation held, Every noise made is a small act of resistance against the encroaching silence. I know I can't stop them permanently. Their needs are too great, their technology too advanced. But I can make it difficult for them, cost them time and resources, maybe buy humanity enough time to develop our own defenses. The Rangers in the Cascades have a new mission now, though it's never officially acknowledged. We're the guardians of sound itself, protectors of the acoustic environment that makes life as we know it possible. The silence is still out there, waiting in dimensions we can barely imagine. But as long as there are voices to sing, instruments to play, and people willing to make noise in defiance of the quiet, we'll keep fighting. The sound in the Cascades must never be allowed to die completely. It's not just about preserving wilderness, it's about preserving the very medium through which consciousness communicates with reality. And every day, I listen for the signs of their return, ready to sing again if necessary, ready to fill the silence with whatever sound I can create. Because in the end, that's all we have, our voices raised against the infinite quiet of a universe that would rather not hear us at all. My name is Jake Morrison, and before that Tuesday in September, I thought I understood Crystal Lake. I've been the head ranger there for 12 years, ever since I got out of the Marines and decided I wanted a quiet life surrounded by nature instead of the chaos I'd left behind in Afghanistan. Crystal Lake seemed perfect, 15,000 acres of pristine wilderness in northern Minnesota, with a jewel of a lake at its center that reflected the sky like a mirror. I should have paid more attention to why it was called Crystal Lake. Should have wondered why the water was so impossibly clear, so deep, so still. Should have asked why the local Ojibwe tribe had always avoided it. The first sign something was wrong came during my routine water quality testing in early September. I've been doing the same tests every month for over a decade: pH levels, dissolved oxygen, temperature readings at various depths. The lake had always been remarkably stable, its ecosystem perfectly balanced. But that September, something had changed. The pH was off, shifted toward alkaline in a way that made no scientific sense. The dissolved oxygen levels were through the roof, as if something was actively producing it deep beneath the surface. And the temperature readings, those made me check my equipment 3 times before I believed them. At the surface, Crystal Lake was a comfortable 72 degrees. But as I lowered my temperature probe deeper, the readings climbed instead of dropped. By the time I reached the 40-foot mark, the water was 85 degrees. At 60 feet, it was 95. And when I hit the probe's maximum depth of 100 feet, the temperature reading was 105 degrees. That was impossible. Lakes don't work that way. Heat rises, cold sinks. It's basic physics. I sent the readings to the state environmental office and waited for their explanation. What I got back was a form letter suggesting I recalibrate my equipment. But I knew my equipment was fine, just like I knew something was very wrong with Crystal Lake. The second sign came a week later, when the fish started behaving strangely. Crystal Lake had always been a fisherman's paradise, home to some of the biggest walleye and northern pike in the state. The lake's clarity meant you could watch the fish swim in the shallows, and over the years, I gotten to know their patterns, their seasonal behaviors. But that September, the fish stopped coming to the shallows entirely. I'd stand on the dock at the boat launch and peer into water that was crystal clear for 15 or 20 feet down and see nothing. No minnows, no bass, no sunfish. The lake looked dead, sterile, like a massive swimming pool. The strange part was that the fish were still there. Anglers continued to report good catches, but only in the deep water, only with heavy tackle that could reach the bottom. And the fish they brought up looked different. Paler than usual, with eyes that seemed too large for their heads. Some of the walleye had growths on their fins that looked almost like fingers, and the pike had developed rows of extra teeth that made their mouths look like bear traps. I collected specimens and sent them to the state fisheries department. They came back with clean bills of health, no signs of disease or pollution. But I'd been looking at fish for 12 years, and I knew what I was seeing wasn't normal. The third sign was the dreams. They started the night after I first took the temperature readings, vivid nightmares that felt more real than waking life. I would dream that I was swimming in Crystal Lake, diving deeper and deeper through water that grew warmer as I descended. The pressure should have crushed me, but instead it felt welcoming, like being embraced by something vast and ancient. In the dreams, I could breathe underwater. The lake would fill my lungs, but instead of drowning, I would feel more alive than ever. And as I swam deeper, I would see lights in the darkness. Not electric lights, but something organic, bioluminescent patterns that pulsed like heartbeat. The lights were beautiful, hypnotic, and they spelled out words and languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They told me stories about the time before time, when the world was young and the old gods swam in seas that covered continents. They whispered about cycles of awakening and sleeping, about the deep places where ancient things waited for the stars to align. And they called to me. Every night, they called me down into the warm depths of Crystal Lake. I started taking sleeping pills, but the dreams broke through anyway. I tried staying awake, but exhaustion would eventually drag me under, and there they would be waiting, the lights, the voices, the warm embrace of impossible water. After 2 weeks of dreams, I started noticing changes when I was awake. My appetite disappeared almost entirely. Food tasted like ash, and even water seemed wrong unless it came from Crystal Lake itself. I found myself making excuses to visit the lake during my rounds, not to do any official business, just to stand at the water's edge and stare into those crystal-clear depths. My skin began to change, too. It started as dry patches on my arms and legs, areas that no amount of lotion could soften. But when I looked closer, the dryness wasn't random. It formed patterns, scales that overlapped like fish skin. And my eyes. Christ, my eyes were the worst part. They'd always been brown, a muddy hazel that my ex-wife used to say looked like tree bark. But as the weeks went on, they began to lighten, shifting toward green, then blue, then a pale silver that reflected light like Crystal Lake itself. I called in sick and drove to the clinic in town, but the doctor found nothing wrong. My blood work was perfect, my vital signs were strong, and according to every test he could run, I was in the best health of my life. But I knew better. I could feel something growing inside me, changing me, preparing me for something I didn't understand. The fourth sign was the visitors. They started showing up in mid-October, drawn to Crystal Lake by dreams they couldn't explain. A family from Iowa who'd driven 8 hours because the father had dreamed about fishing in impossibly clear water. A group of college students from Wisconsin who'd changed their weekend plans because one of them had seen the lake in a vision during a chemistry lecture. They all told the same story, vivid dreams of Crystal Lake, of swimming in warm water, of lights in the depths that called to them like sirens. And they all left changed. The family from Iowa spent 3 days camping at the lake. When they checked out, their youngest daughter, a girl of maybe 8, had developed gills. Functional gills, fluttering on the sides of her neck as she breathed. Her parents didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. They just loaded up their car and drove away, the little girl pressing her face to the window as they left, staring back at the lake with eyes that had gone silver. The college students were worse. They'd arrived as normal 20-somethings, loud and drunk and full of life. But after a night swimming in Crystal Lake, they became quiet, contemplative, spending their days sitting at the water's edge and staring into the depths. When they finally left, they moved differently, their bodies undulating like they were still underwater. I should have closed the park. Should have called in the state authorities, the CDC, someone who could explain what was happening to Crystal Lake and everyone who came into contact with it. But I didn't want to. The dreams had become too strong, too seductive. They promised understanding, evolution, transformation into something greater than human. And deep down, in a part of my mind that was no longer entirely my own, I wanted to see what I was becoming. The answer came on Halloween night. I was doing a final patrol before locking up the park for the season when I saw the lights under the water. Not the bioluminescent patterns from my dreams, but actual lights, dozens of them, moving in formation like a procession or a ceremony. I grabbed my diving gear from the ranger station and suited up without really thinking about what I was doing. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but was drowned out by the song coming from beneath the water, a harmony of voices that spoke directly to my bones. The water was warmer than body temperature as I descended, and I could feel it seeping through my wetsuit, caressing my transformed skin like a lover's touch. My vision, changed by weeks of dreams and mutation, could see clearly in the depths where no human eye should have been able to penetrate. What I saw at the bottom of Crystal Lake redefined my understanding of reality. There was a city down there. Not ruins of some ancient civilization, but a living, thriving metropolis that existed in the space between the lake bottom and some deeper dimension I couldn't comprehend. The architecture was organic, grown rather than built, with structures that pulsed and breathed like living tissue. Bioluminescent coral formations provided light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly because they contained too much meaning, too much truth about the nature of existence. And the inhabitants. They had once been human, I could tell that much. But they had evolved, transformed by their time in the deep places. Their bodies were elongated and graceful, adapted for life underwater. Gills fluttered along their necks and ribs. Their fingers were webbed, ending in claws that could grip the coral structures. And their eyes were like mine had become, silver and reflective, holding depths that suggested intelligence far beyond human understanding. They welcomed me like a long-lost brother. Come down, they sang without words, their voices harmonizing in frequencies that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my soul. Come down and be transformed. Come down and become what you were always meant to be. I tried to resist, tried to swim back to the surface, but my body wouldn't obey. The changes that had been building for weeks were accelerating, and I could feel my lungs adapting, learning to extract oxygen from water instead of air. The beings of the deep city surrounded me, their touch gentle but irresistible. They showed me visions of the world as it truly was, a thin veneer of land floating on vast oceans that contained civilizations older than human history. They showed me the network of underground rivers and lake systems that connected every body of water on Earth, highways for things that had never needed to breathe air or feel sunlight. They showed me my purpose. I was to be a herald, a bridge between the surface world and the deep places. The climate was changing, they explained, the ice caps melting, the sea levels rising. Soon, the old boundaries between land and water would disappear, and humanity would need guides to help them adapt to the new world. Guides like me, like the others who had been called to Crystal Lake and transformed. The process took 3 days. I floated in the warm depths while my body completed its metamorphosis. My lungs developed secondary chambers that could process water. My skin grew a protective layer of scales. My bones became hollow and flexible, designed for life under pressure. And my mind expanded, connecting to the vast network of consciousness that linked every transformed being in every lake, river, and ocean on Earth. When the divers found me floating on the surface, I had been reborn. They pulled me out, performed CPR, rushed me to the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain how I'd survived 3 days underwater, how my body temperature had remained stable, how my brain showed no signs of oxygen deprivation. They ran tests, took samples, asked endless questions. But the equipment couldn't detect what I'd become, and I wasn't about to tell them. How could they understand? They were still bound by the limitations of air-breathing, land-walking existence. I was something more. The Park Service gave me medical leave while I recovered from my near-drowning experience. They expected trauma, PTSD, the fear of water that would end my career as a ranger. Instead, I felt a calm certainty about what came next. Crystal Lake is closed for the winter now, but that doesn't matter. The transformation has spread to other bodies of water throughout the region. Lake Superior shows the same temperature anomalies I first detected. The Mississippi River is calling to people in their dreams. And every day, more of the chosen ones arrive, drawn by visions they can't explain to water that promises to make them whole. I help them understand. I guide them through the change. The surface world thinks it's dealing with isolated incidents, strange drownings, unexplained disappearances, reports of people developing unusual physical characteristics after swimming in certain lakes and rivers. They don't see the pattern yet, don't understand that this is evolution in action. But they will. When the ice caps finish melting and the coastlines redraw themselves, when the old world drowns and the new one rises from the depths, they'll understand. The transformed will be there to help them adapt, to teach them how to breathe water and swim in the deep places. And it all started here in Crystal Lake, where the boundary between dimensions is thin enough for the old ones to reach through and touch our world. I still live in my cabin on the shore, still carry the title of Park Ranger. But my real work happens at night, when I slip into the warm embrace of the lake and swim down to the impossible city that exists in the spaces between spaces. There, I take my place among the council of the transformed, and we plan for the day when all the world's waters will sing the same song, when every lake will be as clear as crystal, and when humanity will finally understand its true destiny lies not in the sky, but in the depths. The change is coming. The waters are rising, and we who swim in the deep places are ready to guide you home.